After my son passed away, my daughter-in-law wasted no time kicking me out of the house. I was devastated, but little did she know the will reading would change everything. As the lawyer read the document aloud, her face went pale when she realized my son had left me everything. She thought she could push me out, but the tables had turned. She could not believe what she heard. My name is Malcolm Wright. I am 69 years old, and I am still recovering from the ultimate betrayal. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family member who underestimated your worth. The dirt on my son Derek's grave was not even dry yet. We had just returned from the cemetery after the most agonizing morning of my entire life. The house was dead quiet, a stark contrast to the heavy grief pressing down on my shoulders. I took off my black suit jacket, feeling the crushing weight of a father burying his only child. Before I could even sit down on the living room sofa, a black plastic trash bag hit me squarely in the chest. I looked up and saw Megan, my 32-year-old daughter-in-law, standing there. She was wearing a designer black dress bought entirely with Derek's credit cards. Her eyes were completely dry. Not a single tear had fallen from them all day. In fact, during the eulogy, I had seen her secretly texting on her phone. She tossed a second heavy trash bag at my feet, making a loud thud against the hardwood floor. "You have 24 hours to clear your junk out of the basement, Malcolm," she said, her voice sharp and devoid of any warmth. "My parents are moving in tomorrow and they need that space." I stared at her in utter disbelief. My son had taken his last breath just days ago after a brutal, relentless battle with illness. He loved this woman with all his heart. He gave her everything she ever asked for, and the moment he was laid to rest, she looked at me like I was a pest she finally had the authority to exterminate. I did not scream. I did not cry. A lifetime in the competitive business world had taught me that the loudest person in the room is usually the weakest. I slowly picked up the trash bags, holding her cold gaze. "Understood," I said quietly. I walked past her and headed down the stairs to the basement. The basement was cold and drafty, but it had been my sanctuary for the past 2 years. When Derek first married Megan, she constantly complained that they needed privacy to start a family. She made it clear that having a father-in-law in the house was cramping her lifestyle. Instead of causing friction between them, I volunteered to move down here. I wanted my son to be happy. I wanted his marriage to succeed above all else. I grabbed my old leather suitcase from the closet and started folding my clothes. Megan thought I was just an old African-American man living off his son's charity. She thought I was a retired nobody entirely grateful for a damp room under her feet. She had no idea who I really was. 10 years ago, I used my life savings to establish Wright Construction. I built a massive enterprise from the ground up, working 18-hour days, securing commercial contracts, and investing in prime real estate across the state. When Derek showed interest in the business, I handed him the reins. I wanted him to be the face of the company, to have the pride of running a successful empire. I bought this very house for him, outright paying cash, so he would never have to worry about a mortgage payment. But I kept the title structured through a family trust. Derek was the registered resident, but I was the silent owner. Megan knew absolutely none of this. She only cared about the designer bags, the luxury vacations, and the high-end cars Derek provided. She never asked how a young man acquired so much wealth so quickly. She assumed he was a self-made millionaire and that I was his dependent father holding him back. I zipped my suitcase shut. Every shirt, every pair of shoes I packed was a reminder of the quiet life I had chosen. I lived simply because I valued peace over ostentation. I drove an old truck because it was reliable, not because I could not afford a luxury vehicle. I let Megan look down on my worn-out boots and faded jeans. I let her make passive-aggressive comments about my modest lifestyle. I endured her subtle racial microaggressions and her constant need to assert superiority because I loved my son dearly. But my son was gone. The only reason I had to tolerate her blatant disrespect was buried 6 feet under the earth. I looked around the empty basement room. It was time to leave the shadows. The next morning, I carried my suitcase up the stairs. I had barely reached the hallway when the front door swung open violently. A yellow taxi was parked in the driveway. Gary and Susan, Megan's parents, stepped out carrying matched sets of designer luggage. They had flown in from out of state, supposedly to comfort their grieving daughter. Gary, a stout man with a perpetual scowl, walked straight into the house without bothering to knock or wipe his shoes. He looked at me holding my suitcase and smirked. "It is about time you packed up, Old man Gary said loudly, his voice echoing in the foyer. Megan told us you were dragging your feet. We do not have all day to wait for you to clear out. Susan pushed past me, her eyes scanning the living room, evaluating the expensive leather furniture I had bought for Derek 2 years ago. She ran her hand over the back of the sofa and smiled greedily. This is going to be perfect for my reading corner, Susan announced, completely ignoring my presence. We can move that big television into the guest room for Gary. Megan rushed down the stairs to greet them. She hugged her parents, performing a dramatic sigh of relief as if she had been trapped in a nightmare. Thank goodness you are here, Megan said. The house already feels cleaner without his stuff cluttering up the place. Gary turned to me and pointed a stubby finger at his heavy leather trunk sitting on the porch. Hey, Malcolm, be useful and bring that up to the master bedroom, Gary commanded. My back is acting up today and you are not doing anything anyway. I stood frozen for a second. The sheer audacity of the demand was staggering. They were standing in my house, claiming my furniture, ordering me around like a hired servant the very morning after I buried my son. A surge of cold, calculating anger rushed through my veins. I looked at Gary. I looked at Susan. I looked at Megan, who was watching me with a smug, satisfied grin. She truly believed she had won the jackpot. She believed she had successfully evicted the burdensome father-in-law and secured her wealthy future forever. I did not argue. I did not defend my dignity. There is absolutely no point in arguing with thieves who are already standing on a trap door. I walked out the front door, stepping right past Gary's heavy trunk. I left it sitting exactly where it was on the porch. "Where are you going?" Gary yelled after me, his face turning red. "I told you to bring the bag up." "Have a nice day, Gary," I said without turning around. I walked down the driveway, the crisp morning air hitting my face. I felt a strange, empowering sense of liberation. The grieving father was gone. The ruthless businessman had returned. I walked 2 blocks down the street and hailed a passing cab. I directed the driver to a quiet downtown hotel where I had already booked a luxury suite. As the car pulled away from the suburban neighborhood, I pulled my phone from my pocket. I dialed a number I knew by heart. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Good morning, Malcolm," Mr. Cohen said. "I am deeply sorry for your loss. I wish I was calling under better circumstances." "Thank you, Cohen," I replied, my voice steady and completely void of emotion. "I need you to initiate the protocols we discussed. Derek's wife has just kicked me out of the house and her parents are currently moving their belongings into the master bedroom as we speak." There was a brief, heavy silence on the other end of the line. Mr. Cohen had been my personal attorney for 20 years. He knew exactly how my assets were structured. He knew exactly what this meant for Megan. "I will prepare the documents immediately," Malcolm, Mr. Cohen said. "The trust is ironclad. Do you want me to serve them the eviction notice today? We can have law enforcement remove them by the afternoon." "No," I said, watching the tall city buildings roll past the window. "Let them unpack. Let them get comfortable. Let them arrange the furniture and believe they own the world. I want to see the exact look on her face when the ground falls out from under her. Schedule the official will reading for this Friday. Send the formal invitation directly to Megan. Make sure she knows attendance is mandatory for the inheritance." "Understood, Malcolm. It will be done exactly as you wish." I hung up the phone and leaned back against the leather seat of the cab. Megan thought she had successfully discarded a helpless, grieving old man. She thought her cruel actions would go unpunished and she could simply take what did not belong to her. She was about to learn a very expensive lesson. I settled into the hotel suite, unpacking my single suitcase. The silence of the room was a sharp contrast to the chaos I had just left behind, but I realized I had left my reliable old SUV parked on the street corner near the house. It was a vehicle I bought under my own name, a quiet machine that never drew attention. I took a cab back to the neighborhood to retrieve it. Just as I unlocked the driver's side door, Megan stormed down the driveway. Her face was twisted with greed and entitlement. Her parents, Gary and Susan, stood on the porch watching with smug satisfaction as their daughter marched right up to me. She snatched the keys directly from my hand, her fingernails digging sharply into my palm. "You are not taking this car, Malcolm." She snapped, her voice loud enough for the neighbors to hear. "Derek paid for everything around here. This SUV belongs to his estate, which means it belongs to me. You can walk or take the bus. You are not stealing my husband's property." I looked at the keys dangling from her manicured fingers. She genuinely believed my son had bought my vehicle out of pity. She had no idea the car was registered entirely to my company. I did not fight her for it. I simply let out a low chuckle. "Keep it. I said calmly. I hope you can afford the gas and the insurance. I turned my back on her and walked away. I did not look back as she stood there looking triumphant. I walked 3 blocks to the main avenue and hailed another cab. I told the driver to take me to the main branch of the First National Bank downtown. It was time to sever the financial umbilical cord Megan had been feeding on for years. The ride gave me a moment to reflect on the monster my son had unwittingly married. Derek was a good man, but love had blinded him to Megan's parasitic nature. I had funded his lifestyle completely, giving him access to the corporate accounts of Wright Construction so he could network with high-level clients and maintain the image of a successful young executive. I never minded the expenses because he was building the business and securing our legacy. But Megan treated those corporate accounts like her own personal piggy bank. She swiped those platinum cards for designer shoes, expensive dinners, and luxury vacations, assuming Derek was just a wealthy genius. She never once questioned where the bottomless pit of money came from. She never knew her father-in-law was the one signing off on every single expense report at the end of the month. I walked through the heavy glass doors of the bank and bypassed the regular tellers. I went straight to the executive suites on the 2nd floor. The branch manager, Mr. Sterling, stood up immediately when he saw me. He had managed the Wright Construction corporate accounts since the day I founded the company. "Malcolm," he said, shaking my hand firmly, "I heard about Derek. You have my deepest condolences. He was a brilliant young man." "Thank you, Sterling," I replied, taking a seat across from his polished mahogany desk. "But I am here on urgent business today. I need to restructure the access to the corporate accounts." I pulled a folder from my briefcase and handed it to him. Derek had a secondary platinum card linked to the primary business account. His wife currently has possession of that card. I need you to freeze it immediately. Terminate all access. Block any pending transactions. Cancel the secondary credit lines. Mr. Sterling typed rapidly on his keyboard. His eyes scanned the screen and he frowned slightly. "Malcolm, there are currently several large pending charges from this morning," he noted. "It looks like high-end furniture stores and luxury boutiques. Do you want me to flag these as fraudulent? Decline them all," I instructed without hesitation. "The corporate account is solely under the name of Wright Construction. Megan has no legal authorization to use company funds. Cut off every single financial avenue she thinks she has." "Consider it done, Malcolm," he said, pressing the final key. "The accounts are completely locked down. She will not be able to spend another dime." I left the bank feeling a profound sense of control. The grief over losing my son was still a heavy anchor in my chest, but taking action gave me a sharp focus. I returned to my hotel suite, poured myself a glass of water, and sat by the large window overlooking the city skyline. I knew it was only a matter of time. The trap was set, and the mouse was already sniffing the cheese. 2 hours later, my phone began to vibrate violently on the glass table. The caller ID flashed Megan's number. I let it ring 4 times before I finally answered. I did not say hello. I just listened to the heavy breathing on the other end. "What did you do, you miserable old man?" Megan screamed into the receiver. Her voice was shrill, echoing with pure, unadulterated panic and humiliation. I could hear the background noise of a busy retail store, people talking, and cash registers beeping. I took a slow sip of my water. "What seems to be the problem, Megan? Do not play dumb with me," she shrieked, her tone growing even more hysterical. "I am standing at the checkout counter of Restoration Hardware. I just tried to pay for $20,000 worth of living room furniture for my parents and my card was declined. The cashier literally cut the card in half right in front of me. Do you have any idea how embarrassing that was? The entire store was staring at me. Gary and Susan are furious. We had a whole day of shopping planned to replace your cheap basement junk and you ruined it." I smiled, a cold, humorless smile. "That sounds like a very unfortunate situation. You hacked Derek's accounts, did not you?" she yelled, her voice cracking with rage. "You went into his computer and messed with his bank passwords. You are a broke, pathetic old man who is jealous of everything my husband built. You are trying to steal from his grieving widow. I am calling the police, Malcolm. I am going to have you arrested for financial fraud. You have no right to touch Derek's money." She was hyperventilating, gasping for air between her vicious insults. She truly believed I was a desperate senior citizen committing cybercrimes to steal her inheritance. The arrogance was astounding. She had lived in a mansion I paid for, eaten food I bought, and worn clothes I financed, yet she still looked down on me because of the color of my skin and the simple clothes on my back. "Are you finished throwing your tantrum, Megan?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that commanded immediate attention. "I am going to destroy you," she hissed through the phone. "Listen to me very carefully," I said, cutting her off completely. "You are not spending Derek's money. You have never spent Derek's money. That platinum card you have been swiping for the past 5 years belongs to the primary business account of Wright Construction. There was a sudden heavy silence on the line. The screaming stopped. I could almost hear the gears turning in her head, trying to make sense of my words.
What are you talking about?
Megan stammered, her confidence slightly wavering but still clinging to her delusions. Derek owned Wright Construction. It was his company. He was the CEO. Derek was the operational manager. I corrected her with surgical precision. I am the founder, the sole shareholder, and the absolute owner of Wright Construction. Every single dollar you ever spent came directly from my pocket. I funded your luxurious lifestyle to keep my son happy. But my son is gone now. You are no longer my problem. Your free ride is officially over. I did not wait for her to respond or process the magnitude of her colossal mistake. I ended the call and tossed the phone onto the table. The financial bloodline was completely severed. She was standing in a high-end furniture store with her greedy parents holding a destroyed credit card and absolutely no way to pay for her extravagant lifestyle. The second domino had officially fallen, and she was totally unprepared for the legal nightmare headed her way. The knock on my hotel room door came early the next morning. I opened it to find a young man in a poorly fitted suit holding a thick stack of manila folders. He asked for my name, handed me the papers, and scurried away down the carpeted hallway. I closed the door and tossed the stack onto the glass coffee table. Megan was moving fast, but she was moving sloppy. I opened the first folder and read the legal jargon drafted by some discount attorney she had likely hired on a contingency fee. It was a temporary restraining order. Megan had formally accused me of being a hostile, unhinged, and senile father-in-law who was actively attempting to steal her marital assets. The document demanded that I remain at least 500 feet away from the residence at all times. It also included an emergency injunction requesting the immediate unfreezing of all corporate bank accounts, claiming I had illegally hijacked her deceased husband's company. She demanded full exclusive control over the house, the vehicles, and the business operating funds. She even had the audacity to request a monthly spousal support stipend to be paid directly from my personal estate to maintain her accustomed standard of living. I did not feel an ounce of fear. I felt a profound sense of pity for her sheer ignorance. She was firing blank cartridges at a reinforced steel vault. She believed the legal system would simply hand her my empire because she shed a few crocodile tears in front of a gullible judge. I placed the documents back into the folder. It was time to arm the real bomb. I left the hotel and took a private car straight to the financial district. Mr. Cohen was waiting for me in his corner office overlooking the city. His desk was immaculately organized with several thick leather-bound binders resting perfectly in the center. I sat across from him and slid Megan's pathetic restraining order across the polished mahogany. Mr. Cohen barely glanced at it before letting out a dry, humorless laugh. He pushed it aside and opened the largest binder. "We are not going to entertain her amateur legal threats, Malcolm," he said, adjusting his glasses. "We are going to bury them entirely." He turned the pages to a document bearing the official seal of the state and my son's signature. This was the authentic last will and testament of Derek Wright. Megan operated under the foolish assumption that Derek died without a localized estate plan, meaning she would automatically inherit everything as his surviving spouse under standard probate laws. She was dead wrong. My son was a kind man, but he was raised by a shark. 3 months before his body finally gave out, Derek came into this exact office. He knew his health was rapidly deteriorating, and he clearly saw the unquenchable greed shining in his wife's eyes. He knew exactly what she would do to me the moment he was gone. So he legally restructured everything. He signed over his 51% operational shares of Wright Construction completely back into the Wright family trust. He also executed a quitclaim deed verifying that the suburban house was merely a trust asset loaned to him for residential purposes. The sole trustee and the ultimate beneficiary of the Wright family trust was me. The documents were ironclad. They completely bypassed standard probate courts. Megan literally owned nothing but the clothes in her closet and the cheap jewelry she bought with my money. Mr. Cohen looked at me with absolute professional certainty. "We have notified the probate judge of the trust structure, Malcolm. Her emergency injunction for the bank accounts has already been dismissed. Now we just need to deliver the final blow." I returned to my hotel suite and opened my laptop. When I originally purchased the house for Derek, I installed a state-of-the-art exterior and interior security camera system. It was a standard safety measure for all my real estate properties. Megan had always hated the cameras, claiming they invaded her privacy, but she never possessed the administrative passwords to disable them. I logged into the encrypted portal and clicked on the live feed for the living room and backyard. The screen flickered to life, and a wave of absolute disgust washed over me. It had only been 3 days since my son was placed in the ground. Yet the house was bustling with caterers carrying silver trays of expensive hors d'oeuvres. Megan was throwing a party. She had invited a dozen of her friends along with her parents Gary and Susan to celebrate her newly acquired status as a wealthy young widow. I watched the live video as Gary stood on my custom-built mahogany patio smoking a thick imported cigar and flicking the ashes directly onto the manicured lawn. Susan was parading around the living room, pointing at the walls and giving loud instructions to an interior decorator about ripping out the dark wood panels to replace them with modern white marble. Megan was the center of attention. She stood by the kitchen island holding a crystal flute filled with expensive champagne. She was laughing brightly, completely devoid of any sorrow. She raised her glass and made a toast to her new chapter, free from the burdensome dead weight of the past. They truly believed they had won. They thought the restraining order had permanently banished me to the streets, and that the frozen bank accounts were just a temporary clerical error their cheap lawyer would fix by Monday. They were treating my son's home like a conquered territory, freely drinking and laughing over his fresh grave. I watched them defile my property with their arrogant entitlement. Every smile, every clinking glass, every puff of cigar smoke only hardened my resolve. I did not feel a shred of mercy for what was about to happen to them. I kept my eyes fixed on the camera feed as the digital clock in the corner of the screen struck 3 in the afternoon. Right on schedule, a sleek black town car pulled into the driveway. A professional courier wearing a sharp uniform stepped out carrying a single thick envelope sealed with red wax. I watched through the front door camera as he rang the doorbell. The party noise dimmed slightly. Megan walked to the door, her face flushed from the champagne, and pulled it open. She smiled arrogantly, probably assuming it was another floral arrangement or a gift basket from a sympathetic friend. The courier handed her the heavy envelope, required her digital signature, and immediately walked away. Megan closed the door and tore open the seal right there in the foyer. I zoomed the camera in on her face. I watched her perfectly manicured nails pull out the heavy parchment paper bearing the imposing letterhead of Mr. Cohen's elite law firm. It was the formal mandatory summons for the reading of Derek Wright's last will and testament scheduled for this upcoming Friday. The document explicitly stated that failure to attend would result in the immediate forfeiture of any and all potential claims to the estate. I watched the arrogant smile completely vanish from her face. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking pale and suddenly very sober. She stared at the paper as if it were a venomous snake. The upbeat party music playing in the background suddenly sounded like a funeral dirge. She knew you do not receive a formal summons from a high-powered corporate law firm unless there is a massive legal structure in place. The ground was finally beginning to crack beneath her feet. Friday morning arrived with a cold, biting wind that perfectly matched the atmosphere inside Mr. Cohen's downtown conference room. I sat at the head of the massive oak table wearing my sharpest tailored suit. My posture was relaxed, but my mind was operating with the precision of a loaded weapon. The heavy glass doors swung open, and Megan marched in, flanked by Gary and Susan. They had dressed in their finest clothes, likely purchased on the very credit lines I had already severed. Megan wore a tight black dress, trying to project the image of a grieving but powerful widow. Gary looked around the opulent office with greedy eyes, already calculating how much he could squeeze from my son's legacy. Susan carried a designer handbag, clutching it like a shield. They took their seats across from me, refusing to make eye contact. The air in the room was thick with hostility. Megan crossed her arms, leaning back in her chair with a defiant smirk. She genuinely believed this meeting was a mere formality, a legal hoop she had to jump through before being handed the keys to the kingdom. She thought my presence was just a courtesy to the deceased. She had no idea she was walking into a meticulously laid trap. Mr. Cohen walked in carrying a single black leather folder. He did not offer any warm greetings. He sat down, adjusted his glasses, and looked directly at Megan. The room fell completely silent. The execution was about to begin. "We are here to formally execute the final wishes of Derek Wright," Mr. Cohen stated, his voice echoing in the quiet room. He opened the folder and pulled out a stack of watermarked parchment. As his legal spouse, Megan sat up straighter, adjusting her posture to receive her crown. Mr. Cohen began to read the legal stipulations. He bypassed the standard pleasantries and went straight for the financial arteries. I, Derek Wright, being of sound mind and body, do hereby revoke any and all previous wills and codicils. I direct that my entire estate, including my 51% operational shares in Wright Construction, all liquid capital in my registered accounts, and all real estate holdings be immediately transferred back into the sole possession of the Wright Family Trust. Mr. Cohen paused, letting the heavy legal terms hang in the air. Megan frowned clearly, struggling to comprehend the dense terminology. "Wait," she interrupted, her voice sharp. "What trust? Everything belongs to me. I am his wife." Mr. Cohen did not flinch. He simply turned the page and continued reading with brutal clarity. "The sole trustee and ultimate beneficiary of the Wright Family Trust is Malcolm Wright. The suburban residence located at Oakwood Drive was provided to me as a temporary residential loan from the trust and shall immediately revert to the trust upon my death. Megan shall retain only her personal clothing and the vehicle registered directly in her maiden name. All other assets are hereby frozen and relinquished to the trustee." Megan stopped breathing. Gary and Susan exchanged panicked glances. The smug confidence completely evaporated from their faces, leaving behind a raw, terrifying realization. Mr. Cohen slid a copy of the finalized document across the table toward her. My son had legally stripped her of everything. The mansion she was currently redecorating, the luxury cars she paraded around town, the corporate credit cards she used to fund her lavish lifestyle, none of it belonged to her. It never did. She had been living in a golden cage built entirely by my money, and Derek had locked the door before he died. I sat perfectly still, watching the color drain from her face. The empire she thought she had conquered was a mirage. She was a queen without a kingdom, standing completely naked in the harsh light of reality. For a moment, the silence was so absolute I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning. Then the explosion hit. Megan slammed her hands flat against the mahogany table and shoved her chair back so violently it crashed into the glass wall behind her. "This is a lie," she screamed, her voice tearing through the refined atmosphere of the law firm. "This is a disgusting, pathetic fake. Derek would never do this to me. He loved me. He promised me everything." She snatched the copy of the will from the table and ripped it in half, throwing the pieces into the air like confetti. Her face was contorted into a mask of pure, unhinged rage. "You forged this, you manipulative old bastard!" she shrieked, pointing a trembling, manicured finger directly at my face. "You sat in your damp little basement and plotted against me. You manipulated him while he was sick." Gary jumped up, his face red with fury. He marched toward Mr. Cohen, raising his fists. "This is illegal," Gary bellowed. "You cannot bypass spousal rights with some phony trust fund trick. My daughter is entitled to half of everything that man earned. We are going to report you to the state bar and have you disbarred." Mr. Cohen remained entirely unfazed. He pressed a small button under his desk. "Please lower your voice, or I will have security escort you out of the building," Mr. Cohen said coldly. This document was signed, notarized, and filed with the probate court 3 months before Derek's passing. It is fully authenticated and legally binding. Megan grabbed a heavy crystal water pitcher from the center of the table and hurled it against the far wall. It shattered into 100 pieces, sending water and sharp shards flying across the expensive carpet. Susan shrieked and pulled her daughter back, trying to restrain her, but Megan was thrashing like a trapped animal. She kicked over a side table, sending magazines and coffee cups crashing to the floor. "I want my house," she sobbed, her voice cracking under the weight of her colossal loss. "I want my money. You cannot take my life away from me." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. I looked at the broken crystal and the spilled water, then slowly raised my eyes to meet hers. "It was never your life, Megan," I said softly. "You were just a guest, and your stay has officially been canceled." Megan stopped thrashing. She stood panting heavily, her chest heaving as she glared at me with pure, venomous hatred. Her pristine image was completely shattered. Her makeup was running, and her designer dress looked wrinkled and out of place in the wreckage she had just caused. She pointed her finger at me one last time, taking a deep, ragged breath. "You think you have won, Malcolm?" she hissed, her voice dropping to a sinister, menacing tone. "You think some piece of paper is going to kick me out into the street? I will drag you through every court in this state. I will hire a team of forensic experts to prove Derek was out of his mind when he signed this garbage. I will tell the judge you coerced a dying man. I am filing an emergency injunction tomorrow morning to freeze every single asset in that trust, and I will personally see to it that your guardianship rights are permanently stripped away. You will be left with nothing but the clothes on your back." Gary grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the door. "We are leaving," Gary spat, glaring at Mr. Cohen. "You will be hearing from our lawyers." They stormed out of the conference room, leaving the heavy glass doors swinging in their wake. The room fell quiet once again, save for the sound of water dripping from the shattered pitcher. Mr. Cohen sighed and adjusted his tie. I looked at the empty doorway, feeling a cold, grim satisfaction. She wanted a war in the courtroom. I was more than ready to oblige. Megan did not waste a single minute. By Tuesday morning, Mr. Cohen called me with an update that I fully expected but still found deeply irritating. Megan and her discount lawyer had filed an emergency injunction with the county court. They claimed Derek was suffering from severe cognitive decline due to the heavy doses of pain medication during his final months of cancer treatment. They boldly argued that the trust transfer was signed under duress and extreme mental impairment. Because the legal system moves cautiously when a supposedly grieving widow plays the victim card, the judge granted a temporary freeze on the assets. The transfer of the house and the company shares was paused pending a full competency hearing. This meant Megan was allowed to remain in the suburban house. She essentially bought herself a temporary fortress. I could clearly picture her and her parents popping another bottle of champagne celebrating this minor victory. They thought a temporary freeze meant the war was turning in their favor. I did not bother sending the police to evict them just yet. I did not smash the windows or demand entry. A smart hunter knows that when a rat feels safe, it gets careless. Let her keep the house for a few more weeks. I had much bigger plans than simply kicking her out onto the street. I needed to know exactly what she had been doing behind my son's back while he was fighting for his life. I knew my son perfectly well. Derek was a brilliant operational manager and he loved his wife unconditionally. For him to secretly walk into Mr. Cohen's office and deliberately strip Megan of her entire inheritance meant he had discovered something utterly unforgivable. Derek was protecting our legacy, but he ran out of time before he could clean up the mess. I needed to finish the job for him. I contacted a highly recommended private investigator named Bradley who specialized in corporate espionage and high-stakes infidelity. I handed him the encrypted drives containing the last 2 years of Wright Construction's financial ledgers along with Derek's personal bank statements. I instructed Bradley to follow the money relentlessly. I wanted to know where every single cent went during the final 6 months of my son's life when he was too physically weak to monitor the daily operations. While Megan was busy posting fake crying selfies on social media, trying to build a narrative of the oppressed young widow, Bradley was digging through her digital dirt. It did not take him long to find the rot. 3 days later, Bradley requested a secure meeting at my hotel suite. He arrived with a thick encrypted tablet and a grim, serious expression. He sat across from me and opened the files. What I saw made my blood run absolutely cold. Megan had not just been swiping corporate cards for designer shoes and expensive dinners. She had been actively bleeding my son's personal accounts dry while he was undergoing exhausting chemotherapy sessions. She had forged his digital signature to liquidate a secondary emergency fund. But the real sinister betrayal was hidden deep within the company payroll system. Bradley pulled up a series of vendor invoices and independent contractor payments that had been authorized from a terminal inside the main office. These were not standard business expenses. They were fabricated consulting fees disguised as structural assessments. Megan had used her access to Derek's laptop at home to approve monthly wire transfers. She was funneling company cash directly into a ghost account. I stared at the banking routing numbers glowing on the screen. The ghost account was registered to a shell company, but Bradley had easily pierced the corporate veil. The ultimate beneficiary of those fabricated invoices was a man named Travis. I felt a sharp, dangerous spike of adrenaline hit my chest. Travis was a 30-year-old white project manager who worked directly under Derek at Wright Construction. I remembered him perfectly well. Derek had hired him 2 years ago, straight out of a mid-tier business program. Travis was smooth-talking, overly confident, and always wore suits that were slightly too expensive for his salary bracket. Derek had mentored him, treating him like a younger brother, showing him the ropes of commercial real estate development. And this was exactly how the parasite repaid him. Megan and Travis had set up a systematic embezzlement scheme right under our noses. Every time Derek was in the hospital, hooked up to machines fighting for another day of breath, his wife and his protege were siphoning thousands of dollars into an offshore account. They had stolen nearly $80,000 in 6 short months. They were building a nest egg for their future together, using the sweat and blood of an African-American family that had worked relentlessly to build an empire from nothing. The pure maliciousness of their actions was staggering to comprehend. They thought Derek was too sick to notice the discrepancies. They thought the old man living down in the basement was too oblivious to ever check the corporate ledgers. But Derek had noticed. He must have seen the unauthorized transfers during his brief periods of clarity. That was why he went to Mr. Cohen. He realized the woman he married was a predator and the man he mentored was a thief. He changed the will to protect the company from being completely drained, but his failing health prevented him from firing Travis or confronting Megan before his lungs finally gave out. He left the execution to me. I asked Bradley if Travis and Megan had any direct communication outside of the company servers. Bradley nodded slowly and tapped the screen to open a new file. The financial theft is only half the story, Malcolm Bradley said, his voice low and serious. I monitored her movements for the past 48 hours. Yesterday afternoon, while her parents were out shopping for new curtains for your house, Megan drove directly to the Wright Construction main office. She used Derek's old security badge to bypass the front desk. Bradley slid a high-resolution photograph across the glass table. I looked down at the printed image and felt a cold, absolute disgust settle deep into my bones. The photograph was taken through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of Derek's old corner office. It showed Megan and Travis. They were clearly not discussing business matters. Travis had her pinned against my dead son's mahogany desk. They were locked in a passionate, intimate embrace, entirely consumed by each other. She had her hands tangled in his hair, her expensive black morning dress hiked up around her thighs. They were defiling the very office where my son had worked himself to the bone. They were celebrating their twisted victory right inside the walls of my empire. They were completely brazen, entirely confident that they had outsmarted everyone. Megan was playing the devastated widow in the courtroom and rolling around with her lover on her dead husband's desk the very next day. The sheer disrespect was beyond anything I had anticipated. I stared at the photograph, memorizing every detail of their smug faces. They wanted to steal my legacy. They wanted to humiliate my bloodline. I looked up at Bradley and handed the tablet back to him. Keep monitoring them, I instructed, my voice devoid of any warmth. Document every movement they make. Track every single dime they spend. The temporary asset freeze was no longer a setback. It was the perfect stage. I was going to let them dance in the spotlight a little longer before I burned the entire theater to the ground. I watched the security feed from my hotel suite as the ultimate disrespect unfolded on my screen. Empowered by the temporary injunction, Megan decided she no longer needed to hide her sickening affair. Just 4 days after the court order was issued, a sleek silver sports car pulled into the driveway of the Oakwood Drive house. It parked directly in the spot that had always belonged to my son. Travis stepped out carrying 2 large duffel bags. Megan ran out the front door and threw her arms around his neck, kissing him right there in the open daylight. She grabbed one of his bags and eagerly led him inside. My blood boiled, but my face remained entirely impassive. She had moved her parasite lover into the very home I purchased for Derek less than 2 weeks after his funeral. Through the interior cameras, I watched them desecrate my son's memory. Travis had the sheer audacity to wear Derek's expensive silk bathrobe and drink from the rare whiskey collection Derek had carefully curated over the years. Gary and Susan, her greedy parents, did not object in the slightest. They happily sat in the living room clinking glasses with the man who had helped embezzle $80,000 from my company. They were throwing a celebration with the cash they had stolen from Derek's personal safe, acting as if they were untouchable royalty. They thought the court injunction gave them a permanent shield to live like kings on my dime. They were completely wrong. An injunction prevents the legal transfer or sale of contested assets. It absolutely does not mandate that I continue to personally finance the daily operations of a house occupied by hostile squatters. I picked up my phone and called Mr. Cohen. I instructed him to immediately contact the city utility departments. The Wright Family Trust was the sole registered account holder for the electricity, the water, the internet, and the gas at that address. I authorized the immediate termination of every single service. I did not suspend them or put them on hold. I permanently closed the accounts. The weather outside was brutally unforgiving, dropping to freezing temperatures as the evening approached. I sat in my warm, comfortable hotel suite and opened the live camera feed on my laptop to watch the exact moment my order took effect. At precisely 7 in the evening, the entire house plunged into pitch-black darkness. The glowing lights of the heated swimming pool vanished. The massive television in the living room shut off abruptly. I watched the infrared night vision cameras kick in. Megan, Travis, Gary, and Susan were stumbling around the living room in total confusion. Gary was waving his arms angrily, clearly shouting in the dark. Travis held up his cell phone using the flashlight to navigate toward the breaker box in the garage. They flipped the switches repeatedly, but nothing happened. It was not a tripped breaker. It was a complete, systematic shutoff. Within an hour, the brutal cold began to seep through the walls. The central heating system was dead. The hot water tank was useless. I watched Megan shivering, wrapped in a thick blanket, dialing her phone frantically. She called the electric company, demanding they restore power to her house. I could easily predict the customer service representative's response. The account was closed by the legal owner, and since her name was not on the deed, she had no authorization to open a new account at that property. The stark reality of her situation finally hit her. She had a mansion, but it was rapidly turning into a freezing, unlivable concrete box. Megan, however, was a master manipulator. When backed into a corner, a rat will use whatever tools it has available. She could not fight me legally or financially, so she turned to the court of public opinion. The next morning, I received an alert on my phone. Megan had uploaded a video to every major social media platform. I pressed play and watched the most calculated performance of her life. She was sitting on the floor of the freezing living room wearing a bulky, oversized sweater. Her hair was intentionally messy, and she had rubbed away her makeup to make her eyes look red and swollen. She looked directly into the camera, her voice trembling with perfectly calibrated vulnerability. She introduced herself as a grieving widow who had just buried her young husband. Then she began to twist the narrative with venomous precision. She claimed her wealthy, powerful black father-in-law was using his massive fortune to brutally oppress her. She cried into the camera, stating I had illegally locked her out of her bank accounts and intentionally cut off the heat and water to freeze her to death in the middle of winter. She painted a picture of a terrified, defenseless white woman being bullied by a vindictive, ruthless corporate tycoon. She completely omitted the fact that she had moved her lover into the house. She omitted the $80,000 she embezzled. She omitted the fact that the house belonged entirely to my trust. She weaponized her tears flawlessly, playing directly into the hands of societal biases. At the end of the video, she posted a link to a crowdfunding campaign begging the public for donations to help her pay for a lawyer to fight for her survival and her basic human rights. It was a sickening display of fabricated victimhood designed to destroy my reputation and line her pockets. The internet is a dangerous machine fueled by outrage, and Megan's video was the perfect spark. Within 24 hours, the video went wildly viral, accumulating millions of views and hundreds of thousands of shares. The comment sections were flooded with absolute vitriol directed at me. Strangers from all over the country called me a monster, a tyrant, and a heartless old man. My company inbox was bombarded with angry emails and anonymous threats demanding I restore the power and give the poor widow her money. The crowdfunding campaign exploded. Outraged citizens poured their hard-earned cash into her account. By the end of the second day, she had raised over $20,000. I watched through the security cameras as Travis hauled 2 expensive gas generators into the backyard purchased directly with the donation money. They plugged in space heaters and celebrated their media victory, laughing at the gullible public that was currently funding their illicit affair. The media narrative was completely against me. I was the villain of the week on every local news blog. Mr. Cohen called me, expressing deep concern about the potential damage to Wright Construction's public image. He suggested we release a statement clarifying the legal ownership of the house and the ongoing embezzlement investigation. I firmly told him no. I did not care about the opinions of angry strangers on the internet. I did not need to defend myself to people who did not know the truth. Let her collect the donations. Let her feel invincible. The higher she climbed on her pedestal of lies, the more devastating the impact would be when I completely shattered it. I closed my laptop and poured myself a cup of black coffee. The media circus was a distraction, but it gave me the perfect cover to execute my next move directly at the heart of her operation. The internet loves a martyr, and Megan played the role flawlessly. By Monday morning, her fabricated video had garnered millions of views across multiple platforms. My inbox became a wasteland of death threats and racial slurs from anonymous keyboard warriors who bought her performance without a second thought. The crowdfunding campaign she linked had surpassed $20,000 and was rapidly climbing toward $30,000. I watched through the security cameras as delivery trucks rolled up to the Oakwood Drive house. Megan and Travis used the donated cash to purchase high-end portable heaters, expensive catered meals, and cases of premium liquor. They were throwing a massive indoor tailgate party funded entirely by the misplaced empathy of strangers. Gary and Susan sat in my son's living room wrapped in designer blankets, toasting to their daughter's absolute genius. They felt victorious. They believed the court of public opinion had effectively handcuffed me. They thought the sheer volume of public outrage would force me to surrender the estate and turn the utilities back on just to save face. They were completely wrong. Public opinion does not sign the checks, and it certainly does not dictate the law. I turned off the monitor and finished my black coffee. It was time to step out of the shadows and reclaim my territory. I put on a charcoal gray bespoke suit and tied a silk tie. I called for a private car and directed the driver to the downtown headquarters of Wright Construction. The building was a towering glass structure I had built from the ground up. Walking through those revolving front doors for the first time since Derek's passing felt like walking into a graveyard, but I shoved the grief deep down into a locked compartment in my chest. The receptionist's eyes widened in shock when she saw me. She immediately reached for her phone, likely to warn the executive floor, but I raised a single finger to stop her. I bypassed the front desk and took the private elevator directly to the top floor. The executive suite was buzzing with anxious energy. Word of the viral video had obviously spread among the employees. People lowered their heads and averted their eyes as I walked down the corridor. They were terrified. They did not know whether I was the monster from the internet or the ruthless founder who signed their paychecks. I walked straight into the main boardroom and instructed my executive assistant to summon the entire senior management team. Within 10 minutes, the room was full. I stood at the head of the long mahogany table. I did not offer any apologies or explanations regarding the media circus. I simply stated that effective immediately, I was resuming total operational control as the chief executive officer of Wright Construction. I demanded a complete audit of every active commercial project and an immediate freeze on all vendor payouts until I personally reviewed them. I watched the relief wash over the older executives who had been with me since the beginning. They knew my leadership style. They knew the ship was no longer rudderless. Order was officially restored. As the management meeting concluded, my desk phone buzzed. It was the head of the accounting department, a meticulous woman named Sarah. She sounded incredibly tense. "Malcolm," she whispered into the receiver. "Travis is down here in the accounting wing. He is causing a massive scene and making aggressive demands." I instructed her to keep him there and walked out of my office. I took the stairs down to the third floor, moving silently. As I approached the glass-walled accounting department, I could hear his arrogant voice echoing down the hallway. Travis was wearing a tailored navy suit likely paid for by the money he stole from my son. He was leaning heavily over Sarah's desk, tapping his fingers impatiently on the glass. "I need my monthly compensation package expedited today, Sarah," he demanded loudly. He spoke with the unearned authority of a man who believed he was untouchable. "And I am not just talking about the base salary. I need the performance bonuses cleared and my expense account fully reimbursed. Derek authorized a substantial raise for me last month before he passed. You need to process the back pay immediately." Sarah looked at her computer screen, visibly shaking. "Travis, I cannot authorize these payouts. The system has locked all executive bonuses pending a corporate audit." Travis slammed his hand on the desk, making Sarah flinch. "Do not give me that bureaucratic garbage," he snapped. "I am the lead project manager. I practically run the commercial division now. If you do not cut that check right now, I will personally see to it that you are replaced by Friday. You work for me now." He was grinning with absolute superiority. He thought because he was sleeping with the supposed heir to the company, he held the ultimate trump card. He believed the entire corporate structure belonged to him and Megan. He was so consumed by his own arrogance that he never even bothered to look toward the doorway. "She does not work for you, Travis," I said. My voice was low, but it cut through the room like a razor blade. Travis spun around so fast he nearly lost his footing. The smug grin instantly vanished from his face, replaced by a sudden, sickening realization. He stumbled backward away from Sarah's desk, his face draining of color. "Malcolm," he stammered, trying to compose himself. "I did not know you were in the building. I was just trying to sort out some administrative errors with my payroll." "You are not sorting out anything," I replied, stepping fully into the room. "You are trespassing on my property." Travis tried to puff out his chest, attempting to muster a defense. "I am the lead project manager. I have legal employment rights here." You have absolutely nothing, I stated coldly, taking a step closer. I have the entire digital audit, Travis. I have the fabricated vendor invoices. I have the offshore routing numbers. I know exactly how you and Megan embezzled $80,000 from this company while my son was dying in a hospital bed. Travis opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He was completely paralyzed. You are officially terminated, effective immediately, I declared, my voice booming across the silent accounting floor. My private investigator has already provided the police with the complete financial dossier regarding your corporate theft. I suggest you walk out of this building right now before I have security drag you out in handcuffs. Travis sprinted out of the Wright construction building like a hunted animal. I stood by the glass walls of the accounting department and watched him flee into the downtown traffic. My private investigator, Bradley, was already tracking his every move. Within 30 minutes, Bradley forwarded a live audio feed directly to my phone. Travis had driven frantically back to the freezing Oakwood Drive house. The moment he burst through the front door, the panic in his voice was unmistakable. He was shouting at Megan. Malcolm knows everything, Travis screamed, his voice cracking with pure terror. He has the corporate audit, the fabricated invoices, and the offshore account routing numbers. The police are coming for me, Megan. I need cash right now or I am going to prison. Megan tried to calm him down, but Travis was completely unhinged. He paced the hardwood floor like a caged predator. His smooth-talking corporate persona was completely shattered. He knew the sheer gravity of corporate embezzlement, and he knew I had the resources to ensure he served a maximum federal sentence. He grabbed Megan by the shoulders and demanded she cash out Derek's life insurance policy immediately. Derek had a $1 million comprehensive life insurance plan. Travis knew about it because he had seen the premium payments cross his desk when he worked under my son. Go to the corporate insurance office today, Travis ordered her. Demand the expedited payout. If you do not get that $1 million right now, I am leaving the state, and I swear to God I will tell the detectives the embezzlement was entirely your idea. Megan was terrified of losing him and even more terrified of facing federal fraud charges alone. She promised him she would secure the massive payout by the afternoon. She believed that $1 million policy was her ultimate golden parachute. She thought it would solve all her problems, pay off Travis, and allow her to walk away from my family with a massive fortune. 2 hours later, my chauffeur pulled into the parking lot of the Apex Insurance Corporate Plaza. I had a scheduled meeting with the board of directors regarding my own commercial policies, but I timed my arrival perfectly. As I stepped out of my vehicle, I saw Megan strutting across the pavement. She had changed out of her oversized sweater and was wearing a sharp designer suit, her hair perfectly styled. The desperate, freezing widow from the internet video was entirely gone. She was practically glowing with arrogance. When she spotted me stepping out of my car, she did not run the other way or avert her gaze. Instead, she marched directly toward me, her high heels clicking loudly against the concrete. She stopped a few feet away, crossing her arms with a triumphant smirk on her face. What a coincidence, Malcolm, she sneered, her voice dripping with venom. Are you here to check on your policies? You should be careful. At your age, you never know what might happen. I looked at her with a completely blank expression. I did not respond, which only fueled her inflated ego. She swung her designer purse like a weapon. She had zero remorse for the fact that the money she was so eager to collect was only available because my son had died a slow, painful death. She viewed his passing purely as a highly profitable transaction. You thought you could break me by turning off the power and stealing the house, she continued, her voice rising with malicious glee. But you forgot about Derek's life insurance. I am the primary beneficiary of a $1 million payout. I am walking into that building right now to collect my check. You can keep your freezing basement and your stupid company. I am going to be a millionaire by dinner time, and I am taking Travis with me. You lose Malcolm. It took every ounce of discipline I had cultivated over my 69 years of life not to destroy her right there on the pavement. But true power lies in patience. I knew exactly what was waiting for her up on the 7th floor of that building. I simply adjusted my suit jacket and offered her a slight cold smile. Good luck with your transaction, Megan, I said quietly. I turned and walked toward the building, leaving her standing in the parking lot. She laughed out loud, genuinely believing she had delivered the ultimate final blow. She confidently marched into the executive suite of the Apex Insurance Building and demanded a meeting with the regional director. She slammed Derek's death certificate and her marriage license onto his polished mahogany desk. She demanded an immediate wire transfer of the $1 million death benefit, citing extreme financial hardship caused by her cruel father-in-law. The director, A stern man named Mr. Sterling pulled up Derek's file on his computer. He looked at the screen, then slowly took off his glasses, looking at Megan with a mixture of professional detachment and absolute pity. "Mrs. Wright, I am looking at your late husband's policy right now," the director said, his voice perfectly even. "The $1 million coverage is indeed active and fully validated. However, there is absolutely no cash payout available to you today or ever." Megan froze. The arrogant smirk instantly vanished from her face. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, slamming her hand on his desk. "I am his wife. I am the primary beneficiary. Give me my money." The director turned his monitor so she could see the finalized legal documents. "You were the primary beneficiary up until 8 months ago, Mrs. Wright," the director explained. "Your husband executed a collateral assignment on this entire policy. Derek had discovered massive financial deficits within his commercial division during his final months of life. Unbeknownst to him at the time, those deficits were caused entirely by Travis and Megan embezzling company funds. To save Wright Construction from defaulting on critical development projects without alarming me, Derek had taken out a massive emergency commercial loan. To secure that high-interest loan, the bank required immense collateral. Derek legally signed over his $1 million life insurance policy to the commercial bank. The director handed Megan a copy of the binding contract. Upon Mr. Wright's passing, the death benefit is automatically triggered to pay off the outstanding balance of the commercial loan. The bank holds the absolute first lien on this policy. The entire $1 million was wired directly to the commercial lender's holding account this morning to satisfy the corporate debt. The blood completely drained from Megan's face. Her breathing became shallow and erratic. She stared at the corporate document as if it were written in a foreign language. The money she thought was her ultimate salvation had already vanished into the banking system to plug the exact financial hole she and her lover had illegally created. The sheer poetic justice of the situation was absolute. She had stolen from the company, and in doing so, she had forced my son to leverage the very insurance payout she was relying on. But the nightmare did not stop there. The director handed her a second piece of paper, a formal notice of liability. Because the life insurance payout did not fully cover the massive interest accrued on the emergency loan, there was still a remaining balance of over $120,000. Since Megan had actively bypassed the Wright family trust and filed legal injunctions claiming she was the sole legitimate heir to Derek's personal estate, she had unwittingly accepted the legal responsibility for his outstanding personal debts. "You do not get $1 million, Mrs. Wright," the director stated coldly. "You get the remaining bill. The collections department will be contacting you shortly regarding the remaining balance." Megan stumbled backward, her legs giving out beneath her. She grabbed the edge of the doorway to keep from collapsing onto the floor. The golden parachute was actually a concrete anvil tied directly to her ankles. She walked out of the insurance building completely destroyed. Her arrogant posture was entirely gone, replaced by the staggering realization of her own demise. She had no house, no company, no credit cards, and now absolutely no insurance payout. She was staring down the barrel of a 6-figure commercial debt and impending federal fraud charges. When she returned to the freezing house empty-handed, Travis would realize she had zero financial value left to offer him. He would abandon her the second he realized the money was gone. The ultimate collapse of her parasitic life had officially begun, and she had engineered every single piece of her own destruction. Megan returned to the freezing Oakwood Drive house completely empty-handed. The crushing reality of her $120,000 commercial debt was suffocating her. But before she even reached the front door, another absolute nightmare unfolded right before her eyes. A heavy-duty tow truck was backed into the icy driveway accompanied by a local police cruiser. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the dark windows of the house. 2 armed officers stood by as the tow operator hitched up her pristine white luxury SUV. She sprinted across the frosted lawn, screaming at the officers to stop touching her vehicle. The lead officer stepped forward and handed her a crisp legal document. It was a formal repossession order. Without the corporate funds from Wright Construction covering the exorbitant monthly lease payments, the dealership had triggered an immediate default clause. Megan watched in absolute horror as the luxury car she paraded around town was dragged away down the street. She ran inside the freezing house seeking comfort from her parents, but found Gary and Susan frantically zipping up their designer luggage in the dark foyer. They had heard the commotion outside and pieced together the disastrous truth. The gravy train had permanently derailed. Gary looked at his daughter with pure, undisguised disgust. He told her flatly that they were not freezing to death in a dark house without electricity to fight a losing battle against a billionaire. Susan did not even offer a goodbye hug or a word of comfort. They hauled their heavy bags out the door and hailed a cab back to the airport. They abandoned their daughter the exact moment she ceased to be a profitable investment. Megan was left standing entirely alone in the dark, icy foyer. Travis came rushing down the stairs, wrapped in layers of thick blankets, his face pale with panic and anger. He immediately asked about the $1 million insurance check. When Megan tearfully confessed the money was entirely gone, swallowed by a commercial bank lien, Travis exploded. He hurled a glass vase against the wall, cursing her for leading him into a federal embezzlement trap with absolutely no payoff. He threatened to pack his bags and flee the state that very night, leaving her to face the police and the fraud charges all by herself. Megan was a cornered animal, and cornered animals are highly unpredictable. Desperation pushed her completely across the line from opportunistic greed into outright felony. She dropped to her knees and begged Travis to give her 24 hours to fix the situation. She grabbed a battery-powered flashlight and ran down to the basement where I used to live, rummaging frantically through the boxes of old corporate files Derek had stored years ago. She found exactly what she needed. It was a stack of heavy stock company letterhead and a blank asset transfer template Derek used for minor real estate acquisitions. Megan carried the papers up to the kitchen table. She pulled out several old birthday cards and legal forms bearing Derek's authentic signature. By the flickering light of the lantern, she spent the next 6 hours meticulously tracing and copying her dead husband's handwriting. She drafted a comprehensive transfer of ownership document. The forged paper explicitly stated that Derek Wright, as the supposed sole owner of Wright Construction, transferred 100% of his corporate shares and complete executive control directly to his wife Megan 2 full years prior to his death. She painstakingly crafted the signature until it was an identical visual match. She even dug up an old notary stamp belonging to a disgraced former employee Travis knew to make the document appear fully authenticated. She truly believed she had just created the ultimate weapon to conquer my empire and save her own skin. The very next morning, Megan and her discount attorney marched into the county courthouse with a renewed, arrogant swagger. They filed an emergency motion submitting the newly fabricated transfer document directly to the presiding judge. They aggressively argued that the Wright family trust one presented was entirely null and void because Derek had supposedly relinquished all corporate and personal assets to Megan long before the trust was ever finalized. The judge reviewed the heavy parchment carefully. On its face, the signature looked perfectly legitimate, and the notary stamp gave it a strong veneer of absolute legal authenticity. The legal system is bound by strict procedural rules, and the sudden appearance of a prior transfer document created a massive jurisdictional conflict. The judge had no choice but to issue a sweeping temporary ruling. He officially reinstated the asset freeze and temporarily recognized Megan as the primary stakeholder of Wright Construction pending a comprehensive forensic verification of the new document. The gavel struck the sound echoing through the courtroom like a gunshot. Megan turned around and looked at me sitting quietly in the gallery. The smug, triumphant smirk returned to her face, brighter and more toxic than ever before. She genuinely believed she had outmaneuvered a man with 40 years of ruthless corporate warfare experience. She strutted out of the courthouse surrounded by a flock of local reporters who were still feeding on the viral victim narrative she spun on social media. She gave a tearful, dramatic interview on the courthouse steps, clutching a copy of the forged document to her chest. She claimed justice had finally prevailed for a grieving widow fighting against a tyrannical father-in-law. She thought she had secured the company, the house, and the massive fortune. She thought the nightmare was over and she had won the ultimate prize. I remained seated in the gallery, my expression entirely unreadable. I did not panic. I did not shout objections. I simply watched her dig her own grave deeper than she could ever possibly comprehend. An hour later, I sat across from Mr. Cohen in his private office overlooking the city. He held a high-resolution scanned copy of Megan's newly submitted transfer document. He placed it flat on the mahogany desk and slid it slowly toward me. At first glance, it looked like a masterpiece of absolute desperation. The signature was an incredibly close match to Derek's actual handwriting, but Mr. Cohen did not look worried in the slightest. In fact, he was smiling a cold, calculating smile that I knew all too well. "Malcolm," he said, leaning back in his leather chair, She backdated the transfer document to August 15th, 2 years ago, to ensure it precedes the creation of your family trust. It is a very bold move. I looked closely at the date, printed clearly at the top of the page. August 15th. Then I looked at the specific watermark embedded faintly in the company letterhead she used. My heart settled into a steady, victorious rhythm. We changed the corporate letterhead design across the entire company last year, I stated, my voice dangerously calm. That specific watermark logo did not even exist 2 years ago. Mr. Cohen nodded, his eyes gleaming with legal precision. Exactly, Malcolm. She forged a legal document on paper that had not been printed yet. But we are not going to reveal that to the judge today. We are going to let her swear under oath that this document is completely authentic. We are going to let her commit federal perjury on the official court record. The final trap was set. She thought she was holding the keys to my kingdom, but she was actually holding a one-way ticket to federal prison. The fluorescent lights of the courthouse deposition room hummed with a low, sterile vibration. We sat around a massive, polished granite table. The atmosphere was completely devoid of any warmth or comfort. A certified court reporter sat at the corner of the table, her fingers hovering over her stenography machine, ready to capture every single syllable for the official state record. Megan marched into the room flanked by her discount attorney. She had dressed specifically for the occasion, wearing a modest, high-necked gray dress and minimal makeup. She desperately wanted to project the image of an exhausted, grieving widow who was simply fighting for her rightful survival against a tyrannical father-in-law. She took her seat across from me and shot me a brief, triumphant glare before adjusting her posture for the camera recording the session. The court official instructed Megan to stand and raise her right hand. She placed her left hand firmly on the Bible and swore under the penalty of perjury to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. I watched her hand resting on that sacred book. She did not hesitate. Her pulse did not flutter. Her breathing remained perfectly steady. She swore a sacred oath to God and the law with the exact same casual ease she used to swipe my corporate credit cards for designer handbags. Mr. Cohen sat beside me, perfectly composed, his posture radiating absolute authority. He opened a thin manila folder and laid her fabricated corporate transfer document flat on the granite table. The deposition had officially begun, and the trap I had meticulously built was now completely armed and waiting for her to step onto the trigger. Mr. Cohen started with standard procedural questions establishing her identity and her legal relationship to my late son. He spoke in a mild, unassuming tone that immediately put her at ease. Then he moved directly to the forged document. Megan instantly turned on the waterworks. She reached into her expensive designer purse and pulled out a tissue, dabbing delicately at the corners of her dry eyes. She painted a vivid, incredibly detailed, and entirely fabricated story. She claimed that on the morning of August 15th, 2 years prior, Derek woke up feeling deeply burdened by the future of the company. She looked directly into the camera lens and stated that Derek sat her down at their kitchen table, pouring her a cup of coffee, and confessed his absolute fear of my overbearing control over his life and his legacy. She swore under oath that Derek handed her this specific transfer document, claiming he had secretly drafted it to protect her from my ruthless business tactics. According to her narrative, Derek signed the paper right there in the sunny kitchen, looking her deeply in the eyes and telling her she was the true heir to the Wright empire. Mr. Cohen let her speak without a single interruption. She spun a web of lies so intricate and emotionally charged, she almost seemed to believe her own fiction. She described the casual clothes Derek was supposedly wearing that morning. She described the warm weather that day. She explicitly stated that they celebrated the corporate transfer with a quiet, romantic dinner at home that exact evening. Listening to her use my dead son's memory to construct a financial heist made my blood boil in my veins, but my face remained an impenetrable mask of stone. She was layering lie upon lie, completely unaware that she was weaving her own financial and legal noose. She spoke with absolute unwavering conviction, cementing the date, the time, and the location into the permanent, unalterable legal record. I sat across from her, maintaining total, absolute silence. I did not show a fraction of anger. I did not shout objections or slam my hands on the table to call her a liar. I simply watched her arrogant micro-expressions as she confidently answered Mr. Cohen's questions. She interpreted my silence as the silence of a defeated man. She truly thought we had no defense against her perfectly crafted emotional story. Mr. Cohen leaned forward, resting his hands lightly on the table. He did not challenge the validity of the signature immediately. He did not mention the watermark on the paper. Instead, he focused entirely on locking down her timeline, leaving her absolutely no room to claim a memory lapse later. He asked her to confirm the exact date 3 separate times. "Are you absolutely certain this transfer occurred on August 15th? Mrs. Wright, Mr. Cohen asked, his tone deliberately soft and accommodating. Megan nodded vigorously. "I am completely certain," she replied, her voice ringing with fake, unshakable confidence. "I remember it clearly because it was just a few days before our wedding anniversary. It was August 15th, and we were sitting in our kitchen in the Oakwood Drive house all morning." Mr. Cohen nodded slowly, playing the role of a baffled and defeated attorney. He then slid a formal sworn affidavit across the granite table. He asked her to sign the document legally certifying under penalty of federal perjury that the events she just described regarding August 15th were absolute, unvarnished facts. Megan's lawyer skimmed the paper quickly and gave her a confident nod of approval. He was just as blind as she was. He thought they had successfully cornered us and secured a multi-million-dollar settlement. Megan picked up a heavy black pen and signed the affidavit with a dramatic, arrogant flourish. She pushed the paper back across the table, a smug, triumphant smirk breaking right through her grieving widow facade. I watched the dark ink soak into the white paper. The deed was officially done. She had willingly crossed the line of no return. She had just committed felony perjury on the state record. Mr. Cohen carefully picked up the signed affidavit, inspecting the wet ink before placing it securely into his briefcase. The atmosphere in the room instantly shifted, dropping 10 degrees in a single second. He reached back into his leather bag and pulled out a thick, heavy stack of certified medical records bearing the prominent official seal of Johns Hopkins Hospital. He dropped the heavy stack directly in the center of the table, right next to her forged transfer document. The loud thud echoed through the room. The smug smile on Megan's face faltered slightly, her eyes darting between the hospital logo and my lawyer's cold expression. "Mrs. Wright, you just swore under penalty of federal perjury that your husband signed this document at your kitchen table on August 15th, 2 years ago." Mr. Cohen stated, his voice suddenly sharp and lethal. "However, these certified medical records prove unequivocally that on August 15th, 2 years ago, Derek Wright was not sitting in your kitchen. He was in the intensive care unit at Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, 500 miles away, undergoing his first aggressive round of chemotherapy. He was heavily sedated, intubated, and medically unconscious for 3 consecutive days." The color instantly drained from Megan's face, leaving her looking like a hollow ghost. Her jaw dropped open, but absolutely no sound came out of her throat. Her cheap lawyer grabbed the medical records, his hands shaking wildly as his eyes scanned the irrefutable documented proof. Megan stared at the hospital seal, her breathing turning rapid and shallow as panic seized her chest. The grand illusion of her victory shattered into a million irreparable pieces right in front of the camera. She had just handed us the exact weapon needed to destroy her completely. The suffocating silence in the deposition room was suddenly broken by the frantic tapping of the court reporter's keyboard. She was officially documenting the exact moment Megan committed federal perjury on the state record. Megan's eyes darted frantically around the massive granite table, searching for an exit that simply did not exist. The fabricated transfer document lay completely useless next to the ironclad medical records bearing the Johns Hopkins seal. She tried to open her mouth to speak, to invent another desperate lie to cover her tracks, but her vocal cords completely failed her. She was suffocating under the crushing weight of her own towering arrogance. She had willingly walked into a sworn deposition, raised her right hand, and lied directly to the court in a brazen attempt to steal a multi-million-dollar corporate empire. Mr. Cohen sat back in his leather chair, folding his hands neatly on his lap. He did not yell or gloat. He simply allowed the devastating reality to settle heavily over the cold room. Perjury in a federal proceeding carries a maximum sentence of 5 years in prison. Mr. Cohen stated, his voice sharp and utterly devoid of mercy. "You just swore under oath that a comatose man signed a corporate transfer deed at your kitchen table. We have the camera footage of you signing that affidavit. We have the medical records proving the absolute impossibility of your fabricated timeline. You have officially committed a felony, Mrs. Wright." Megan's discount attorney reacted with the pure survival instinct of a man watching his entire career evaporate before his eyes. He snatched his hands away from the forged document as if the paper itself were radioactive. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping violently against the polished floor. He packed his briefcase with frantic, jerky movements, leaving his expensive fountain pen on the table in his rush to flee. He knew any further association with a federal crime would permanently destroy his legal practice. "I am formally withdrawing as your legal counsel, effective immediately," he announced, his voice trembling with unprofessional terror. He looked directly at the court reporter, making absolutely sure his withdrawal was officially documented on the record. "I had absolutely no prior knowledge of this fabricated timeline. My client provided me with this document under the explicit assurance of its authenticity. I will not be a party to federal perjury or corporate fraud." He did not even look at Megan as he practically sprinted out of the conference room, leaving her completely abandoned. She sat frozen, staring at the empty chair beside her. The impenetrable armor of the grieving widow had completely shattered, leaving nothing but a pathetic criminal waiting for her inevitable arrest. I did not waste another second looking at her miserable face. I stood up, buttoned my suit jacket, and walked out of the room alongside Mr. Cohen, leaving her alone with the court reporter and her impending federal charges. While Megan was breaking down in the downtown courthouse, her parasite lover was executing his own cowardly escape plan. Through the remote security cameras at the Oakwood Drive house, I watched Travis panicking in the master bedroom. Megan had undoubtedly texted him the disastrous news before her lawyer fled the room. Travis knew the forged document was their absolute last resort. With that document destroyed and Megan facing federal prison, he knew the corporate embezzlement investigation was about to crush him. He did not hesitate for a single second. He pulled 2 large duffel bags from the closet and began shoving his tailored suits, expensive watches, and stolen cash into them. He was throwing designer shoes across the room, frantically tearing through my dead son's old belongings to see if he could snatch anything else of value before the authorities arrived. He was a rat abandoning a sinking ship, showing absolutely zero loyalty to the woman who had ruined her entire life for him. He zipped his bags shut, threw on a heavy coat, and sprinted down the main staircase. He thought he could simply walk out the front door, hail a cab, and vanish into the city to escape the consequences of stealing $80,000 from my company. He was completely wrong. Travis yanked the heavy front door open, balancing the 2 overstuffed duffel bags on his shoulders. He stepped out onto the freezing porch, expecting a clear path to freedom. Instead, he walked directly into a solid wall of dark blue uniforms. 2 unmarked police cruisers and a standard patrol car were parked diagonally across the icy driveway, completely blocking his escape route. 4 armed detectives stood on the frosted lawn, their badges flashing aggressively under the harsh winter light. My private investigator, Bradley, had forwarded the complete unredacted financial dossier regarding the corporate embezzlement directly to the Financial Crimes Unit 48 hours ago. They had been waiting for the perfect moment to execute the arrest warrant. Travis dropped his bags, the heavy thud echoing across the quiet suburban neighborhood. He immediately raised his hand, stepping backward toward the door in sheer panic. The lead detective marched up the porch stairs, pulling a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt. Travis did not put up a fight. His arrogant swagger completely evaporated, replaced by the pathetic whimpering of a cornered coward. He started talking before the detective even read him his Miranda rights. "It was all her idea," Travis shouted, his voice cracking as the cold steel clamped down tightly around his wrists. "Megan orchestrated the entire thing. She had access to the corporate accounts. She forged the vendor invoices. I was just following her instructions. I will testify against her. I will tell you everything she did to her husband. Just let me make a deal." He was selling out his lover within 10 seconds of facing law enforcement. He desperately tried to shift the blame, sobbing and pleading with the officers as they dragged him down the driveway toward the back of the patrol car. He begged the detectives, offering to wear a wire offering to hand over the offshore routing numbers. He stripped away his own remaining dignity to save his skin. The neighbors peeked through their curtains, watching the spectacular downfall of the man who had paraded around my son's house like a king just a few days prior. He was shoved into the back of the cruiser, his face pressed against the cold glass. The massive corporate embezzlement scheme, the illicit affair, the stolen money, it all culminated in a pair of handcuffs and a ride to the county jail. He thought he was smart enough to steal from Wright Construction and outmaneuver a man with 40 years of corporate warfare experience. He ended up leaving the house exactly as he had entered it, a pathetic parasite with nothing to his name. The police confiscated his bags as evidence, locking them in the trunk of their vehicle. The sirens did not even blare as they drove away. His removal was swift, quiet, and absolute. By late afternoon, the legal dominoes fell with staggering speed. The presiding judge, who had initially granted Megan's temporary asset freeze, received the certified transcript of the deposition along with the irrefutable medical records from Johns Hopkins Hospital. The evidence of blatant forgery and perjury was absolute. The court did not wait for a formal hearing to correct the egregious manipulation of the justice system. The judge immediately issued an emergency order striking down the temporary injunction and completely dissolving the asset freeze. The fraudulent claims were officially dismissed with prejudice, preventing Megan from ever filing them again. Mr. Cohen called me with the finalized documents as I sat in my hotel suite overlooking the city. The legal barriers were entirely obliterated. The 51% operational shares of Wright Construction and the deed to the Oakwood Drive house were officially recognized as the unencumbered property of the Wright Family Trust. I had regained total, absolute ownership of my entire empire. Megan had tried to use the law as a weapon to steal my legacy, but the law had just snapped back and shattered her completely. The company was safe. My son's hard work was protected. I hung up the phone and stood up, buttoning my suit jacket. The paperwork was finally cleared, but there was still one physical mess left to clean up. It was time to return to my son's house and deliver the final crushing blow in person. I rode in the back of my private car, watching the familiar suburban streets roll past the tinted windows. The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long, freezing shadows across Oakwood Drive. Every block we passed brought back profound memories of my son. I remembered teaching Derek how to ride a bicycle on these very sidewalks. I remembered the absolute pride in his eyes when I first handed him the keys to this massive property. Megan had tried her hardest to poison those precious memories, but tonight I was washing her stain away completely. As my driver pulled up to the property, the flashing red and blue lights of two local police cruisers painted the front of the brick house in a chaotic, frantic rhythm. The emergency eviction order Mr. Cohen had successfully secured was not a polite request. It was a mandatory, immediate vacating directive authorized by a county judge who did not take kindly to blatant federal perjury. I stepped out of the vehicle and buttoned my heavy wool overcoat. The freezing winter wind bit at my face, but the icy satisfaction burning in my chest kept me perfectly warm. The county sheriff and 3 armed deputies were already standing on the front porch holding the finalized court documents in their hands. They did not knock politely. They banged heavily on the thick oak door, demanding immediate entry. The fraudulent legal shield Megan thought she possessed had been completely obliterated. The house belonged entirely to the Wright Family Trust, and I was the sole legal owner. The door swung open, revealing a terrified, completely disheveled Megan. The sheriff stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, thrusting the eviction notice directly into her trembling hands. The officers commanded everyone inside the property to gather their immediate personal belongings and vacate the premises without delay. There would be no grace period. There would be no packing vans. The fortress of lies she had built was being dismantled brick by brick right in front of her eyes. Gary and Susan had scurried back to the house the very minute Megan secured her temporary fraudulent injunction earlier that week. Like greedy parasites sensing a fresh host, they had quickly unpacked their designer luggage, completely ready to resume their lavish lifestyle on my dime. They had undoubtedly been drinking my expensive whiskey and celebrating their perceived victory over the grieving father-in-law. Now they were being aggressively herded out the front door by uniformed police officers. The sheer public humiliation on their faces was absolutely magnificent to witness. Gary stumbled out onto the freezing porch carrying 2 heavy, overstuffed suitcases, his face a violent shade of crimson. He was sweating profusely despite the winter chill, puffing and panting as the deputies ordered him to keep moving toward the street. Susan followed closely behind, clutching her expensive leather purse to her chest as if the police were going to strip it directly from her hands. The moment their expensive shoes hit the icy concrete driveway, their unconditional parental loyalty completely evaporated. They turned on their daughter with a viciousness that even surprised me. Gary dropped his heavy bags on the frost-covered ground and pointed a shaking accusatory finger directly at Megan's face. "You stupid, arrogant girl!" Gary shouted, his voice cracking with pure, unadulterated rage. "You told us you had this handled. You told us the old man was permanently defeated and the money was totally secured. Now we are being thrown out into the freezing street like common criminals because of your sheer incompetence. You ruined our lives." Susan did not offer a single word of defense for her weeping daughter. She looked at Megan with profound, absolute disgust. "We flew across the country for this," Susan hissed, her breath pluming in the freezing air. "We trusted you to secure our comfortable retirement." "You are a complete embarrassment, Megan. Do not bother calling us for help." You got yourself into this miserable mess, and you can rot in it alone." They did not even look back as they dragged their heavy-wheeled suitcases down the icy pavement toward the main road, desperately trying to hail a passing cab. They abandoned her for the second and final time, completely washing their hands of the daughter who could no longer fund their endless greed. They walked away, stripped of their arrogance, leaving Megan entirely isolated on the frozen lawn. Megan stood shivering violently in the biting wind, wearing nothing but a thin silk blouse and leggings. The police officers stood by the front door watching her with absolute professional indifference. They had strict orders to enforce the eviction and had zero tolerance for her dramatic antics. She had absolutely nothing left. Her fraudulent legal strategy was destroyed in front of a court reporter. Her federal perjury charges were imminent. Her parasite lover Travis was currently sitting in a county jail cell awaiting federal processing. Her greedy parents had just publicly disowned her right on my driveway. She slowly turned her head and looked at me standing quietly near my car. The crushing realization of her total and absolute defeat finally crashed down upon her shoulders. The arrogant smirk, the condescending tone, the racist microaggressions, they were all completely eradicated. Her knees suddenly gave out beneath her. She collapsed onto the frozen grass, weeping hysterically into her hands. She crawled across the frost-covered lawn, dragging herself toward my feet like a broken, wounded animal. She looked up at me, her makeup streaming down her cheeks in dark, ugly streaks, her hands clasped together in a desperate, pathetic plea. "Malcolm, please," she sobbed, her voice hoarse and shattered. "Please, do not do this to me. I have nowhere to go. I have absolutely no money. Travis took everything and my parents just left me here to die. Please have mercy." I stood perfectly still, looking down at her pathetic form. I did not step back, but I did not reach out to help her either. My face remained a mask of impenetrable stone. She reached out and grabbed the hem of my heavy wool overcoat, pulling on it desperately. "Malcolm, I am Derek's wife," she cried, weaponizing my dead son's name in one final sickening attempt at emotional manipulation. "Derek loved me. He would not want you to throw me out into the freezing street like this. Please remember how much he loved me. We are family. I beg you, Malcolm, give me one more chance. I will do whatever you want. Just do not leave me out here to freeze." I looked at the woman who had spent the last 3 years treating me like an uneducated burden. I looked at the woman who threw trash bags at my chest the very morning after I buried my only child. I looked at the woman who slept with another man on my son's mahogany desk while he was suffocating from cancer. She dared to invoke the word family. She dared to speak my son's name, hoping it would unlock some hidden reservoir of paternal forgiveness. She was fundamentally incapable of understanding that my capacity for forgiveness died the exact second she betrayed my bloodline. I looked down into her tear-filled eyes. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell or curse at her. The most devastating weapon a man can wield is his absolute unshakable composure. I smoothly pulled the hem of my overcoat from her trembling grasp, smoothing the dark fabric with a calm, deliberate motion. I leaned down slightly, ensuring my voice would cut through her hysterical sobbing perfectly. I looked right into her dark, hollow soul and delivered the exact same verdict she had given me when she thought she held all the power in the world. "You have 24 hours to clear your junk out of this house," I stated, my voice cold, clear, and entirely devoid of mercy. "The locks are being changed tomorrow morning, and my people are moving in." Megan gasped loudly as the words hit her like a physical blow to the chest. She recognized the brutal sentence immediately. It was the exact phrase she used to kick me out of the basement while the dirt on my son's grave was still fresh. She stared up at me, her mouth opening and closing in sheer terror, realizing that her own vicious cruelty had just become her permanent reality. I straightened my posture and turned my back on her, leaving her weeping uncontrollably on the frozen grass. I walked toward my waiting car, the heavy crunch of my boots on the icy driveway echoing loudly in the quiet suburban evening. I opened the door and slid into the warm leather seat. I did not look out the window as the driver pulled away from the curb. The house was finally mine again. The parasite was officially removed. The brutal reckoning was complete, and I had absolutely no regrets. The morning after the eviction, the news cycle exploded with brutal efficiency. The viral video Megan had so carefully orchestrated to destroy my reputation became the exact weapon that annihilated hers. The local media got wind of the federal perjury charges, the forged corporate transfer document, and the embezzlement scheme involving her arrested lover Travis. The internet is a ruthless judge, and it immediately turned its massive collective fury directly onto her. The crowdfunding campaign she used to harvest $20,000 from sympathetic strangers was permanently frozen by the platform administrators under a sweeping fraud investigation. People who had donated their hard-earned money demanded immediate refunds, flooding her social media pages with relentless outrage and absolute disgust. She had gone from a tragic grieving widow to a despised federal criminal overnight. Her discount lawyer was completely out of the picture, leaving her to rely on an overworked public defender who advised her to prepare for a multi-year prison sentence. She was facing multiple felony counts, including perjury, corporate fraud, and grand larceny. The false narrative she had spun was entirely dismantled. She was publicly ruined, financially devastated, and facing serious time behind bars. I did not waste a single moment reveling in her digital destruction. I had a physical mess to eradicate. At exactly 8 in the morning, I pulled into the driveway of the Oakwood Drive house, accompanied by a professional estate liquidation and cleaning crew. I unlocked the front door with my newly minted set of keys and stepped into the freezing foyer. The air was stale, smelling of cheap perfume and stale champagne from their disgusting celebration parties. I instructed the crew chief, a no-nonsense foreman named Marcus, to be absolutely ruthless. I wanted every single trace of Megan, Gary, and Susan completely scrubbed from the property. The crew moved with military precision. They marched into the master bedroom and immediately began ripping out the expensive silk curtains Susan had audaciously ordered. They hauled down the oversized vanity mirrors, the excessive cosmetic racks, and the ridiculous velvet lounge chairs Megan had purchased using my corporate credit cards. I watched as they tossed Gary's leftover cigar boxes and imported liquor into heavy black trash bags. Every physical footprint of their parasitic existence was systematically erased from the premises. The crew scoured the guest bedrooms, scrubbing away the lingering stench of their arrogance. They dismantled the luxury patio furniture and rolled up the expensive imported rugs that had been stained by their careless, drunken celebrations. I stood in the center of the living room, directing the operation with cold, detached efficiency. This was not just a deep clean, it was a complete and total exorcism of the toxic energy that had infected my son's home. They had treated this house like a free luxury resort entirely devoid of respect for the man who actually provided it. I watched the crew haul out massive boxes of Megan's abandoned possessions. When she crawled on the frozen lawn begging for mercy, she had left behind a mountain of gross materialism. I felt a profound sense of relief as each box was carried out the front door. The house was finally breathing again. The dark, suffocating cloud she had cast over the property was dissipating with every trash bag thrown into the back of the moving trucks. While the crew handled the heavy lifting, I took on a much more sacred and personal task. I walked alone into Derek's home office. This was the only room Megan had largely ignored because it did not contain anything she could wear or pawn for quick cash. I closed the door behind me, sealing out the noise of the cleaning crew. I walked over to his solid mahogany desk, running my hand along the polished wood where he had spent countless hours reviewing blueprints and commercial contracts. I carefully opened the bottom drawer and pulled out a stack of framed photographs. There was a picture of Derek and me standing in front of the very first Wright construction work site. He was just a teenager wearing a hard hat that was entirely too big for him, flashing a brilliant, proud smile. I traced the edge of the frame, my chest tightening with a deep, agonizing sorrow. I packed these memories with absolute reverence. I boxed up his college degrees, his architectural awards, and the vintage watch I had given him on his 30th birthday. I gathered the small, meaningful pieces of the boy I raised and the man he had become, ensuring his true legacy was perfectly preserved. In stark contrast, I stepped out into the hallway to oversee the disposal of Megan's luxury hoard. The cleaning crew had piled dozens of designer handbags, high-end stilettos, and custom-tailored dresses in the center of the living room. I refused to let a single item remain under my roof. I ordered Marcus to load the entire collection of luxury goods into a separate truck. I was not going to burn them or throw them in the landfill. I instructed the crew to drive the truck directly to a local women's shelter that helped victims of domestic abuse re-enter the workforce. Megan's ill-gotten wardrobe would be donated entirely to women who actually needed clothes for job interviews and court appearances. The extravagant furniture, the massive flat-screen televisions, and the ridiculous crystal chandeliers were loaded up and sent to a charity auction house. Every single dime generated from the sale of her vanity project would be donated directly to cancer research in Derek's name. I transformed her disgusting greed into a vehicle for absolute good. Her entire identity was boxed up, shipped out, and repurposed to serve the very community she had always looked down upon with such blatant aristocratic disdain. By the late afternoon, the house was completely empty. It echoed with a hollow, clean silence. The carpets were steam-cleaned, the walls were wiped down, and the locks were permanently secured. I stood in the empty foyer and looked around the massive suburban space. It was pristine, but it no longer felt like a home. It was a crime scene. It was the physical location where my son had suffered, where he had been betrayed by the woman he loved, and where I had been insulted and discarded. The walls held too much dark history. The pristine kitchen counters reminded me of her fabricated deposition. The master bedroom was forever tainted by the memory of her twisted affair with Travis. I knew I could never walk through these halls without feeling the phantom sting of her sheer audacity. I pulled my phone from my coat pocket and dialed my premier real estate broker. I instructed him to list the Oakwood Drive property on the market immediately. I wanted it sold as quickly as possible, but I made one absolute unyielding condition. I was not going to sell it to a corporate developer or another greedy social climber looking for a suburban palace. I wanted to handpick the buyers myself. I wanted to completely cleanse the legacy of this property by giving it to someone who actually deserved it. My real estate broker moved swiftly, scheduling private viewings by the end of the week. I instructed him to vet the candidates thoroughly. I wanted absolutely no corporate investors or wealthy trust fund heirs looking for a suburban playground. One brisk Tuesday afternoon, I sat quietly in the empty dining room while the broker walked a prospective couple through the property. They were a young African-American couple dressed neatly but modestly in work attire. The husband was a high school science teacher named Michael, and his wife, Alicia, was a pediatric nurse. I watched them from the corner of my eye. They walked through the halls with profound reverence, treating the space with genuine respect. They admired the craftsmanship of the mahogany trim and spoke excitedly about the large backyard. But when they sat down with the broker in the living room, the brutal reality of the housing market crushed their enthusiasm. They had pre-approval for a standard mortgage, but they were completely short on the massive 20% cash down payment required for a luxury property of this caliber. Michael rubbed his face in frustration, explaining that medical bills from a family emergency had recently drained their savings. Their faces fell into expressions of quiet defeat. They thanked the broker politely, preparing to walk away from a home they deeply loved but simply could not afford. I watched Michael place a gentle, comforting hand on Alicia's shoulder. He pulled her close and whispered that they would keep saving, and their time would eventually come. That simple gesture hit me like a physical blow to the chest. It was the exact same way I used to comfort my late wife Josephine over 40 years ago. We were standing in a cramped, unfeeling bank office being denied our first business loan because we lacked collateral and the right connections. We had absolutely nothing to our names except relentless ambition and our devotion to each other. Michael had the exact same quiet, fierce determination in his eyes that I possessed back then. Alicia carried Josephine's gentle strength and unwavering, supportive grace. They were building a life the right way through honest hard work and mutual respect. They were the absolute antithesis of the parasitic greed Megan had brought into my family. I remembered the endless double shifts, the exhausted sleepless nights, and the countless doors slammed in our faces simply because of our background and our lack of generational wealth. This young couple was fighting that exact same uphill battle today. They were dedicating their lives to serving our community as a teacher and a nurse, yet the systemic financial barriers were designed to keep them locked out of homeownership. I stepped out of the shadows of the dining room and introduced myself directly. They were visibly surprised to see the owner personally on site. I asked them to sit down with me on the folding chairs my broker had provided. I spent the next 30 minutes asking about their lives, their professions, and their long-term goals. They spoke with deep passion about wanting to start a family in a safe neighborhood and building a foundation for their future children. There was zero entitlement in their voices. There was only genuine, sincere hope. I looked at them and saw the exact reflection of my own past. I saw the legacy I wanted to cultivate. My broker cleared his throat, attempting to gently usher them toward the door since they could not meet the immediate financial requirements. I raised my hand and stopped him instantly. I told the broker that traditional bank financing was no longer necessary for this transaction. Michael and Alicia looked at me with total confusion. I leaned forward, resting my hands on my knees, and explained my terms. I told them I was not looking to extract a massive profit from this piece of real estate. I was looking for the right custodians to heal its future. I offered them a private seller financed contract directly through the Wright Family Trust. I would act as their bank. I eliminated the massive down payment requirement entirely. I set the interest rate at a flat 0%. They would simply pay the principal value of the home in manageable monthly installments directly to my trust. Michael sat completely speechless, staring at me as if I were speaking a foreign language. He asked me why I would do such an incredibly generous thing for absolute strangers. I looked around the empty living room where Megan had once thrown her arrogant celebrations. I told him this house had recently been infected by toxic greed and dangerous entitlement. It needed a complete spiritual cleansing. It needed a family that fundamentally understood the true value of honest work and genuine love. It needed to become a real home again, not a hollow status symbol. I told them about my son Derek. I told them how I built my construction company from the absolute ground up. I wanted my son's ultimate legacy to be tied to community empowerment and generational uplift, not corporate hoarding. Alicia began to weep softly, covering her mouth with her trembling hands. She explained they had been aggressively outbid by corporate investors on 6 different modest homes over the past year. This was their absolute miracle. I pulled out my phone and called Mr. Cohen right then and there. I instructed my lawyer to draft the private mortgage documents by Friday morning. The broker stood stunned, realizing he was losing a massive percentage commission, but I wrote him a generous personal check to cover his time and dismissed him. 1 week later, we met back at the Oakwood Drive house for the final legal signing. The paperwork Mr. Cohen drafted was beautifully simple, legally binding, and completely bypassed the predatory banking system. Michael signed the thick contract with a steady, confident hand. Alicia wiped away tears of profound joy as she added her signature right next to his. I picked up the heavy brass keyring from the kitchen counter. It was the exact same set of keys Megan had furiously snatched from my palm just a few weeks ago. I placed them firmly into Michael's hand, curling his fingers around the metal. I told them to fill these walls with loud laughter, with happy children, and with uncompromising love. As I walked down the driveway toward my waiting car, I did not feel the crushing, heavy weight of grief that had anchored my soul since Derek's funeral. I felt a soaring, absolute sense of peace. I turned back and looked at the brick house one last time. Michael and Alicia were standing on the front porch, holding each other, looking out at their bright new future. The dark, toxic shadow Megan had cast over the property was entirely eradicated. The house was breathing again. The painful, traumatic chapter was officially permanently closed. I got into the backseat of my car and instructed my driver to head downtown. I had an empire to rebuild. The moment I stepped through the revolving glass doors of Wright Construction headquarters, I could feel the suffocating weight of corporate panic radiating from the lobby. The scandal involving Travis and Megan had inevitably bled into the commercial real estate gossip mill. The industry is a ruthless shark tank, and the scent of blood was heavily concentrated in the water. Our major corporate partners, commercial lenders, and key suppliers were getting extremely nervous. They saw a high-profile embezzlement case, a federal perjury scandal, and a grieving 69-year-old African-American founder stepping back into the chief executive role. To them, I was an antiquated relic who had supposedly surrendered control years ago. They doubted my physical stamina and questioned my modern business acumen. Several critical development contracts were suddenly paused pending further financial review. The local news segments were running constant updates on the fraud investigation, casting a dark shadow over our daily operations. 2 of our largest material suppliers demanded immediate cash payments up front, refusing to honor our long-standing 30-day net credit terms. The financial vultures were actively circling the glass building, waiting for my empire to fracture and collapse under the weight of my personal tragedy. They fundamentally misunderstood who they were dealing with. I did not build a multi-million-dollar enterprise by asking for permission or folding under external pressure. I built it by dominating the room and crushing anyone who stood in my way. I instructed my executive assistant to summon every single department head, senior vice president, and key external investor to the main glass-walled boardroom on the top floor. I scheduled the meeting for exactly 10 in the morning and explicitly stated that the heavy mahogany doors would be locked at 1 minute past the hour. I walked into the boardroom carrying a single thick leather binder. The massive table was packed with anxious executives shifting uncomfortably in their expensive tailored suits. A few of the external white investors sat with their arms crossed, wearing expressions of barely concealed skepticism. They were waiting for me to deliver a weak emotional apology for the recent public circus. I did no such thing. I walked directly to the head of the table and dropped the heavy binder onto the polished surface. The loud, echoing thud silenced the room instantly. I looked around, making direct, piercing eye contact with every single person present, ensuring they felt the sheer gravity of my presence. I projected the master financial ledgers onto the massive digital screen behind me. I did not sugarcoat the situation or hide behind corporate jargon. I explicitly detailed the exact dollar amount Travis had embezzled and then immediately displayed the multi-million-dollar private capital reserves I had personally injected into the corporate accounts that very morning to completely eradicate the deficit. I reminded them with brutal clarity that while my son Derek was a brilliant operational manager, I was the ultimate architect of this entire empire. Derek brought modern innovation to the table, but I provided the unbreakable steel framework. I poured the initial concrete. I negotiated the foundational zoning laws. I broke through the systemic racial barriers decades ago when half the men in this room would not even shake my hand or offer me a basic bank loan. I told them that Wright Construction was not a fragile modern startup susceptible to a minor internal theft. It was an impenetrable fortress built on blood, sweat, and absolute discipline. I commanded the room with the raw, unfiltered authority of a man who had nothing left to lose and everything to protect. I made it clear that I was officially back at the helm and the era of soft leadership was permanently over. The sheer force of my presentation shocked the room, but corporate arrogance is a stubborn disease. A senior investment partner named Mr. Sullivan leaned forward, attempting to challenge my authority. He was a wealthy developer who had always patronized my son, and he foolishly thought he could intimidate me in front of my own staff. He aggressively stated that his firm was deeply concerned about structural instability and threatened to pull a massive $20 million backing from our upcoming downtown commercial project. He claimed the board needed a younger, more dynamic leader to navigate the current public relations crisis. I did not raise my voice or break eye contact. I calmly opened my leather binder and pulled out a single sheet of watermarked paper. I slid it across the long table directly into Sullivan's hands. It was a certified cashier check drawn from my personal private trust, made out for the exact amount of his initial investment, plus the standard penalty fee for early termination. I told Sullivan he could take the check, walk out the glass doors, and permanently sever his relationship with Wright Construction right this second. I informed him and the rest of the board that my personal liquidity far exceeded their combined corporate backing. I then exposed his own vulnerability, reminding the room that his firm desperately needed our specific zoning permits to complete their adjacent luxury developments. If he pulled out, I would legally block his access roads by the end of the business day, costing him triple his investment. Sullivan stared at the check, the color completely draining from his arrogant face. His bluff was spectacularly called. He slowly slid the check back across the table, muttering a quiet apology and explicitly confirming his ongoing commitment to the project. I turned my attention back to the rest of the room. I immediately called out two middle managers who had been secretly colluding with Travis during his tenure. I had my private security team march into the boardroom and escort them from the building right then and there. I established absolute ironclad discipline. I made it unequivocally clear that loyalty was the only currency I accepted. Any individual harboring doubts about my capacity to lead this company was invited to resign immediately and leave their stock options on the table. Nobody moved a single muscle. The rebellion was completely crushed before it even took a breath. Order was brutally and beautifully restored. The commercial real estate industry operates entirely on the principles of power and stability. Word of my ruthless boardroom purge spread through the financial district like wildfire. The narrative shifted instantaneously from corporate vulnerability to absolute unyielding strength. The competitors who had been circling our contracts backed off, completely terrified of inciting a war with a founder who possessed massive independent wealth and zero tolerance for disrespect. Instead of losing partners, we began attracting heavier hitters. Major developers realized that Wright Construction was backed by a man who operated with cold surgical precision. The very investors who had questioned my stamina were now clamoring to increase their stakes in our upcoming developments. Within 3 weeks of my return, we did not just stabilize the company, we aggressively expanded it. We secured a massive state-funded contract to develop a sprawling new medical research facility. It was a monumental project Derek had been pursuing for over a year, but the client specifically requested me to personally oversee the architectural implementation after witnessing my swift corporate takeover. The financial deficits caused by the recent betrayals were completely erased and replaced by unprecedented profit margins. The empire was not just salvaged, it was completely fortified. I had successfully transformed a deeply personal tragedy into the greatest era of corporate expansion in the history of my company, proving to the entire city that the right legacy was absolutely untouchable. 6 months after I reclaimed my company, the final act of this bitter saga unfolded within the sterile wood-paneled walls of the federal courthouse. The media circus that Megan had so eagerly ignited on social media had completely turned against her. News vans and independent journalists crowded the courthouse steps, hungry for the final chapter of the viral widow who tried to steal a corporate empire. Their cameras flashed relentlessly as I approached, but I paid them no mind. I walked through the heavy double doors of the courtroom, flanked by Mr. Cohen. I wore the exact same tailored black suit I had worn to my son's funeral. It felt entirely appropriate to wear it to the burial of his betrayers. We took our seats in the front row of the gallery, directly behind the prosecution tables. The courtroom was packed with spectators, former employees, and curious locals eager to witness the final judgment. The heavy oak doors at the side of the room swung open and the bailiffs led the defendants inside. The atmosphere instantly grew heavy. The legal machinery was fully in motion, and there were no more temporary injunctions or fabricated social media videos to hide behind. The judge, a stern, unforgiving woman with zero tolerance for white-collar crime, took her seat at the bench. She looked down at the defendants with absolute judicial disdain. The room fell into a pin-drop silence as the clerk called the docket number and the sentencing phase officially commenced. Travis stood before the judge first. His expensive tailored suits were completely gone, replaced by the standard-issue beige uniform of a federal detainee. He kept his head bowed, staring intensely at the wooden defense table. His defense attorney had desperately brokered a plea deal by flipping on Megan, detailing exactly how they orchestrated the embezzlement and the forgery. But federal judges do not reward parasites who steal from grieving families. The judge delivered a scathing reprimand detailing the $80,000 he siphoned from Wright Construction and the sheer cowardice he displayed by attempting to flee the state to avoid prosecution. She made it abundantly clear that corporate espionage combined with familial betrayal warranted severe consequences. She banged her gavel and sentenced Travis to 5 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole for good behavior. He flinched visibly as the sentence was read, but offered no defense. The bailiffs immediately handcuffed him and escorted him out of the room. He did not look back. Then it was Megan's turn. She was forced to stand before the bench, completely stripped of her manipulative power. The judge did not hold back a single ounce of fury. She explicitly addressed the abhorrent nature of Megan's crimes. She detailed the extreme cruelty of using a dying man's signature to forge a corporate transfer deed. She highlighted the absolute audacity of walking into a sworn deposition and committing federal perjury on the state record. The judge also brought down the hammer regarding the fraudulent crowdfunding campaign. The platform had already frozen the funds, but the judge legally mandated that every single cent of the $20,000 be fully restituted to the donors, along with heavy punitive fines imposed by the Federal Banking Commission. Megan was ordered to pay back the stolen corporate funds through mandatory wage garnishment upon her eventual release. The judge looked Megan directly in the eyes and delivered the final blow for the charges of federal perjury, corporate fraud, and grand larceny. Megan was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison. The heavy wooden gavel struck the sound block, echoing through the silent courtroom like a thunderclap. The golden parachute she had so viciously tried to deploy had officially transformed into a concrete cell block. I sat perfectly still in the gallery, observing the absolute destruction of the woman who had tried to erase my bloodline. Megan stood trembling at the defense table. She was wearing a loose, poorly fitted bright orange jumpsuit that hung awkwardly on her frame. Her wrists and ankles were bound by heavy metal chains that clinked loudly with every slight movement she made. The pristine, glamorous image she had weaponized for years was entirely eradicated. Her hair, which used to be perfectly styled and meticulously maintained, hung in dull, lifeless strands around her face. There was no expensive makeup to hide the deep, dark circles under her eyes. The sheer physical toll of her impending incarceration was already manifesting on her body. Her skin was pale and sallow, stripped of the expensive spa treatment she used to charge to my corporate credit cards. The unyielding arrogance that had defined her every action, the smug smirk she wore when she threw trash bags at my chest. The cruel laughter I heard on the hidden recordings, it was all completely extinguished. She looked remarkably small. She was no longer the untouchable white corporate wife looking down her nose at her African-American father-in-law. She was just another convicted felon waiting to be processed into the federal penal system. As the bailiffs approached to escort her away, she slowly turned her head and looked back into the gallery. Her hollow, desperate eyes searched the crowd until they locked directly onto mine. I did not blink. I did not offer a victorious smile or a nod of satisfaction. I simply looked back at her with the cold, impenetrable gaze of a man who had successfully defended his empire against a ruthless invader. I saw the profound, agonizing realization dawn on her face. In that fleeting moment of eye contact, she fully understood the catastrophic magnitude of her greed. She realized that she had traded a life of absolute luxury and genuine security for a cold steel cage simply because she could not contain her own toxic entitlement. She had tried to dig a grave for me, but she had ultimately buried herself alive. Her lower lip trembled, and she mouthed a silent plea, but it was entirely useless. The bailiffs firmly grasped her arms and turned her around, marching her through the heavy wooden side doors. The heavy steel latches clicked shut behind her, permanently sealing her fate. The courtroom began to empty as the spectators murmured amongst themselves, filing out into the wide marble hallways. Mr. Cohen closed his leather briefcase and offered me a firm, respectful nod. The long, brutal legal war was officially over. We had successfully navigated the treacherous legal minefield and emerged completely victorious. I stood up from the wooden bench and buttoned my tailored suit jacket. I walked down the center aisle of the courtroom feeling an incredible sense of lightness in my chest. The crushing, suffocating burden of the past few months had been entirely lifted. As I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the courthouse, the crisp afternoon air hit my face. The reporters shouted questions from the bottom of the steps, eager for a sensational quote from the victorious billionaire founder. I completely ignored them. I did not need to boast or gloat for the evening news cameras. True power speaks for itself. I walked down the concrete steps toward my waiting private car. My driver opened the rear door and I slid into the quiet, comfortable leather interior. The engine purred to life and we pulled away from the curb, leaving the courthouse and the media circus entirely behind us. The scales of justice had been perfectly balanced. Derek could finally rest in absolute peace, knowing his father had protected the family honor. The parasites who tried to feed on my son's legacy were locked behind bars, and the empire we built together was stronger than ever. I looked out the tinted window at the bustling city streets, finally feeling a profound, absolute peace settling over my soul. One entire year passed since the heavy oak doors of the federal courthouse slammed shut on the darkest chapter of my life. The seasons cycled through the brutal winter that tested my resolve straight into a vibrant and unyielding spring. Wright Construction did not just survive the violent tremor of corporate espionage and familial betrayal. We expanded with a level of aggressive precision that left our commercial competitors completely breathless. The medical research facility contract I secured immediately after reclaiming my chief executive title was completed 2 full months ahead of schedule and significantly under budget. The local business journals that once gleefully speculated on the downfall of my empire were now publishing extensive profiles on our record-breaking quarterly profits. I walked through the glass corridors of my downtown headquarters every single morning feeling a profound sense of absolute stability. The executive floor hummed with focused, relentless energy. The middle managers who once doubted my stamina were replaced by brilliant, hungry professionals who understood that loyalty and competence were the only currencies I accepted. The parasitic rot that Megan and Travis injected into the company bloodline was completely eradicated. The corporate ledgers were immaculate. Every vendor invoice was verified and every offshore routing vulnerability was permanently sealed by a top-tier cybersecurity firm. My personal life mirrored the immaculate order of my business. The sprawling suburban house on Oakwood Drive was no longer mine. Michael and Alicia, the young African-American couple I sold it to via private contract, had transformed it into a genuine home. They sent me a handwritten card last month announcing they were expecting their first child. The The toxic energy of the past was entirely washed away, replaced by the promise of a bright new generation. I sat in my corner office looking out over the sprawling city skyline, knowing that order was completely and permanently restored. With the corporate empire thoroughly secured, I turned my absolute focus toward the future. Wealth is completely useless if it solely sits in a bank account accumulating digital interest. I wanted to forge a weapon against the systemic financial barriers that almost suffocated me when I first started out. More importantly, I needed to memorialize my son in a way that truly reflected the brilliant, generous man he was before a predator manipulated his kindness. I summoned Mr. Cohen to my office and directed him to allocate $10 million from my private trust to establish the Derek Wright Innovation Fellowship. This was not a standard charity offering small grants for textbooks. This was a massive, aggressive venture capital fund designed specifically to bypass the predatory banking systems that systematically deny loans to young minority entrepreneurs. We opened a beautiful application center in the heart of the city, entirely staffed by seasoned financial advisors and business strategists. We targeted young African-American men and women who possessed raw, undeniable talent but lacked the generational wealth required to get a seat at the commercial table. The program provided full seed funding, comprehensive mentorship, and direct access to Wright Construction's massive network of industry contacts. Within the first 6 months of operation, we fully funded a sustainable tech startup, an affordable housing initiative, and a minority-owned architectural firm. I personally reviewed the final business pitches sitting at the head of the boardroom table. When a brilliant young woman from the South Side stood before me and pitched a revolutionary green energy project, her fierce determination reminded me so intensely of Derek. She had the same sharp analytical mind and the same unwavering passion for building something that would actually outlast her. I signed her funding approval on the spot. Megan tried to use my son's name to steal a fortune and buy designer handbags. I was using his name to build entire communities and launch generational wealth for families who had been historically locked out of the system. The sheer contrast between her toxic greed and this explosive positive growth was the ultimate victory. I was not just protecting an empire anymore. I was actively funding an army of brilliant young minds who would eventually reshape the entire city skyline. On the exact anniversary of my son's passing, I instructed my driver to take me to the quiet, manicured grounds of the city cemetery. The weather was remarkably clear. The sky was a brilliant, unbroken blue, and a gentle, warm breeze rustled the leaves of the ancient oak trees lining the paved pathways. I stepped out of the car carrying a single bouquet of pristine white lilies. I walked slowly down the familiar grass path, feeling the solid earth beneath my polished leather shoes. The crushing, debilitating weight of grief that had almost forced me to my knees a year ago was gone. In its place was a profound, deep-seated tranquility. I stood before the polished black marble headstone bearing the name Derek Wright. The engraved letters gleamed brightly in the morning sunlight. I knelt down with deliberate care and placed the white lilies at the base of the stone. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the crisp, clean air. "We did it, son," I said, my voice steady and completely clear, carrying across the quiet green expanse. "The company is completely secure. The predators who tried to feed on your hard work have been eradicated. They are sitting in federal concrete cells, stripped of their arrogance and their stolen luxury. I made sure they paid for every single ounce of disrespect they showed to your memory." I brushed a fallen leaf away from the polished marble surface. I told him about the massive success of the Innovation Fellowship. I told him about the young, brilliant architects and engineers who were building their dreams entirely because his legacy funded their initial steps. I told him about Michael and Alicia transforming the Oakwood Drive property into a home filled with genuine love and the upcoming birth of their new baby. "You were a good man, Derek," I continued, looking directly at the engraved letters of his name. "Your only mistake was believing that everyone possessed the same generous heart that you did. You trusted the wrong person, and she tried to use that trust to destroy everything we built together. But you were smart enough to recognize the threat before the end. You handed me the legal sword and I swung it with absolute precision. You can rest now. The watch is over. The gates are permanently secured and no one will ever compromise the Wright family name again." I stood up, slowly adjusting the cuffs of my tailored suit. I did not shed a single tear. Crying is for the defeated, and we were totally victorious. I felt a profound spiritual connection in that quiet moment. I felt the undeniable assurance that my son was finally at peace, completely untethered from the parasitic greed that plagued his final months on Earth. I turned away from the black marble headstone and began the slow walk back up the gentle green incline toward the main road. The morning sun was climbing higher into the sky, casting a warm, brilliant golden light across the sprawling cemetery grounds. I walked with my shoulders squared and my head held high. My stride was completely unhurried, but it carried the heavy, undeniable rhythm of absolute authority. I was 69 years old, but I felt a renewed surge of powerful, unyielding vitality coursing through my veins. I had faced the absolute worst form of familial betrayal. I stared directly into the ugly face of entitled greed, and I completely crushed it without compromising a single fraction of my dignity. The painful, traumatic chapter was permanently closed. The toxic shadows of the past were entirely burned away by the harsh, unforgiving light of justice. As I reached the paved road, my private car was waiting the rear door already held open by my driver. I did not look back at the gravesite. I looked straight ahead toward the towering glass silhouette of the city skyline glittering brightly in the distance. The empire was safe. The legacy was completely purified. I stepped into the warm sunlight, feeling the absolute quiet triumph of a father who fought a brutal war for his son and emerged completely victorious. Reflecting on the entire ordeal, I realized the greatest lesson was about the fundamental nature of true power. Megan and her parents operated under the incredibly foolish assumption that power must always be loud. They genuinely believed that wearing designer labels, throwing expensive parties, and screaming arrogant orders at a grieving father equated to absolute dominance. They mistook my calculated silence for submission and my simple lifestyle for financial incompetence. They were deeply infected by a blinding disease called entitlement. They confused their mere proximity to my son's wealth with the actual ability to generate it. They thought the corporate crown belonged to them simply because they managed to sneak into the castle. They never once considered the brutal, relentless strength required to build the castle in the first place. I spent decades navigating a commercial real estate world completely designed to keep men who look like me firmly locked outside the gates. I learned very early on in my career that you never announce your strategy to the enemy. You never boast about your hidden resources. You let your opponents talk. You let them brag and boast and show their entire hand while you sit quietly and calculate their exact point of absolute failure. Megan dug her own grave because she lacked the basic humility to respect the quiet architect standing in her basement. She was so utterly blinded by her unearned privilege and her subtle racial prejudice that she completely failed to see the loaded weapon resting patiently in my hands. The ultimate lesson here is that you can never permanently steal what you are fundamentally incapable of building. A parasite can drain a host for a little while, but it can never replicate the host's unyielding strength. Megan desperately wanted the empire, but she possessed absolutely none of the discipline, the sacrifice, or the raw grit required to sustain it. When you build your life on a fragile foundation of lies and exploitation, you are constantly living on borrowed time. The universe has a remarkably precise way of balancing the scales. True wealth is not measured by the luxury cars parked in your driveway or the balance on your stolen corporate platinum cards. True wealth is the unshakable integrity of your character and the absolute certainty that you can rebuild your entire empire from the ground up if everything burns down tomorrow. I walked away from this war not just with my financial assets completely intact, but with my soul entirely unburdened. I protected my bloodline, and I permanently secured my peace. Never mistake a person's quiet grace for defenselessness, because some of the most dangerous people in this world are the ones who do not feel the need to prove their strength until you force their hand. If my story resonated with you, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with anyone who needs a firm reminder to never tolerate disrespect from toxic family members.